striving to have it to be a better document, better process, better program than we have right now. So just please be interactive. Please be, professional, cordial, courteous tonight, as we always are, and we expect you to be. And then if you have, additional items you want to talk about in the future that aren't covered tonight, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Cannabis Division, and we will further these discussions. This is going to be an ongoing process. This is not just a one-time good deal. Thanks.
And as Drew gets ready to walk us through some things, I do want to also mention for the folks that are on via Zoom, we have that so that people can really more observe than actively participate, because the way that we're running these, it's really about the people that are here and us engaging in a conversation, and that's very difficult to do with people on a screen. So we do check with a chat and raised hands and things like that to give a little bit of input, but just sort of the people on Zoom know we're glad you're here to observe. We'll try to incorporate your input, but it won't be as active. Yes.
Because we're actively in the middle of harvest season right now.
So the question before we'll get a little bit into this, but was, since this is an active time for the cultivation industry, that there are people that can't be here at these times. Will there be other opportunities? So Drew is going to cover what other opportunities there are, and then we can take input about that. Okay, Drew, are you ready to go?
Working on it.
Oh, okay. And I see fellow Supervisor Heidi Carpenter Harris has also joined us. And I mentioned this last night because Liam Gogan was with us in Hayfork, and that sometimes people see 3 supervisors and say, wait a minute, Brown Act violation, you can't all be here. And we had checked with county council coming into this to make sure it's okay, that basically, whether it was Heidi or Liam or any other supervisor that wants to be here besides Dan and I, who are officially engaged for the ad hoc committee, they can observe, they just can't participate. So even if you turned and asked her a question, she's not allowed to answer because she's just here to observe. Okay? So we're keeping ourselves out of trouble. And we still working?
Yeah, we just had some feedback from trying to monitor chats on
Okay.
a different device, but I think we're ready to go.
Okay.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Drew Plabani, Cannabis Division Director. We're going to take you through these first slides, and Rick kind of already presented to you all sort of the general overview. But if we go to the second slide. This is our sort of rough agenda for the evening. So I'm going to take you through history and purpose, overview of the current ordinances. We've actually moved that next slide, overview of problems and proposed solutions, towards the end because it was a bit redundant. So
I left it there. Oh, okay.
And then the proposed timeline for ordinance amendments, and then the opportunities for public input. And I think that we'll probably get through that in a little less than 30 minutes tonight, because this is our second go around. We got a little bit of practice. And then, excuse me, I'll turn it back over to Rick. So if we go on to the next slide, actually 2 slides forward probably. So the history and the purpose. The history is essentially that Trinity County Cannabis Program began in 2016 and was enacted by Ordinance 815-823. Since 2016, there have been multiple amendments, additional ordinances, and also rule changes or reg changes with the DCC. And so the most recent ordinance was adopted concurrent with the adoption of the Cannabis Program Final EIR in 2020. And I think most of you are probably aware, but the purpose of an ordinance is just to establish, in this particular cannabis ordinance, to establish a commercial cannabis permitting program regulated by Trinity County to allow for a variety of commercial cannabis activities while protecting public health and safety and welfare by enacting strong and effective regulatory and enforcement controls. So that is the main purpose. One of the things that we identified in this last year is sort of the different roles and responsibilities between the county's responsibility as the land use authority and the lead agency for CEQA versus the DCC's responsibility, which is establishing and enforcing state regulations and their licensing program. So next slide, please. So this slide is showing you an overview of the current ordinances. Essentially, we have adopted 10 separate county ordinances, starting with 1743, which was the overarching commercial cannabis regulations. And then, moving through, we've got nursery, distribution, cannabis testing, cannabis non-storefront retail, micro business, manufacturing. Mitigation measures were codified after the adoption of the EIR, cannabis storefront retail, and the cannabis processor license. And so within each of these currently adopted ordinances, they follow the general pattern, which is shown on the right hand of the slides, which is essentially purpose, definition, limitations, application or application requirements, regulations, performance standards, required findings, required conditions, mitigation measures, denial, revocation, enforcement, and fees. And so one of the things that we've done is to consolidate many of these redundant sections from each of the standalone ordinances into overarching sections that are now covering all of the ordinances rather than having 10 redundant sections that essentially have much of the same information. Here you can see our proposed timeline. September 19th, we released this first draft to the public, which hopefully most of you here in the room have had a chance to review. We are going to, we had a public meeting last night, tonight, and then next week, October 4th, here in board chambers again. Following that, ad hoc will review all of the public input received and start working on the second draft. Then the following week, we're gonna shoot to finalize the second draft and get the second draft available to the public on the 20th, leading up to the first reading of the second draft at the Planning Commission. And again, what we're proposing and hoping to achieve is that we get that second reading of this proposed ordinance to the Board of Supervisors in December, so that we can have it ideally adopted before the end of this calendar year. And so this last slide is just kind of covering again, what Rick has mentioned and what I kind of went through in terms of the timeline. There are a number of opportunities for public input, the 3 public workshops that we're having, and then the Planning Commission meeting, which is tentatively scheduled for October 26th, and then the Board of Supervisors on December 5th. There should also be comment cards on that front side table. So if you have comments from tonight and you want to fill out a comment card, they're there for you, or you can always send comments to cannabis.ordinance@trinitycounty.org, and staff will be going through and collecting all those comments so that we can take them into consideration as we prepare the second draft. And I think that gets me to turn it over to Rick.
So, get over here on the mic. So on the screen is something similar to my chicken scratch over here, but these are the categories that we thought people might really want to dig in on. And so you can see them. Oh, not anymore. See them here. We'll just look over here. We have these, and what you're seeing there in my numbers is when we polled people last night, which ones do you most want to talk about? This was kind of the results. Only last roll, I guess. But what we're going to do before we ask for your input on that is as we did last night, we said, well, what are things that you want to talk about that might not be on this list? So that's our first start, is for you to kind of raise your hand. I'll call on people and let me know, are there subjects other than these that you want to make sure we spend some time on this evening? And this over here.
You have to click on this.
Okay, so what other subjects might you want to talk about, Matt? The definitions we have.
The limitation of location.
Oh, wait,
and the
wait, we do.
exclusion zones.
I'm sorry, just a minute. We do have definitions, don't we?
Well, that was one of the ones that came up last night as a. You kind of went through the definitions yesterday, like before you got
okay.
into everything.
Okay, sorry, let me just get this, Matt. Okay, go ahead, Matt.
But I'd really like to talk about the limitation on location and the exclusion zones kind of in general.
Okay,
There's 2 sections
I don't
where.
know what
we have,
Overlay.
that's under overlay zone, so we'll get
Yeah.
that, okay?
There's that, and then there's the limitation on location, which is a different section than the overlay zones. But it kind
So
of
maybe
applies in
that's
the same
allowable.
way.
Is that under allowable zoning?
The
Either
overlay
way,
zone?
it should be the
No.
same.
The limitations.
Section.
overlay
The limit,
is
yeah, the
allowable
limitations would be turned into allowable zoning.
Okay, the limitations will be under allowable, so
And
over
just
there,
that buffers, I think, is a big thing that people want to talk about.
okay, and that's there too. Okay, so they're on our list already and we'll get some prioritizing. Terry? Finances for code enforcement.
And it doesn't sound like that's across 26.
Any other things that you want to make sure that we cover tonight?
Kind of a few other things that are small.
Oh, we'll get the whole list.
Right, the non-conforming use, there's something I would like to comment about.
Okay,
Simply on that. The enforcement. There's not
okay,
non-storefront retail and manufacturing.
Rick, did you have a sensitive receptor?
I think you're right.
Yes. Oh, is that under definition? Yeah. probably.
Yeah. it would be.
Just these, right? Yeah. It's hard to tell.
There's a lot of
I think we should just go page by page.
Well,
and
I guess,
talk about it.
so the question, when you say about the sensitive receptors, do you want to just understand what the definition is, or do you want to talk about how it's applied? Because the definitions is really about just what is it, what do we mean?
I want to understand why we added, I want to see the evidence for adding elderly and asthmatics. So I want to understand what that means.
Okay, so
I
that
want
would,
the studies about how it's going to harm them.
so we can get that under definitions. Yes, sir.
How are we prioritizing?
Okay,
I have multiple neighbors that are epileptic that basically are still having positive like life. But it's
Okay.
medically beneficial.
sure. Anything else that you want on our list? Okay, so then we'll do what we did last night, and this does require the honor system just to get through this rather quickly. But what we're asking you to do is look at those lists and choose your top 3. And so when I go through each one, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if that's one of your top 3. And that will give us a starting point for the prioritized list. We got pretty dang far through our list last night. But that's how we'll go. So
Overlay and allowable zoning should be the same.
Yeah, didn't you
Yeah, can we
say that was gonna be
consolidate
the
some of
same or
these?
no?
No.
The
Or the,
exclusionary
I'm
is
sorry,
separate.
the limitation on location, where would that be?
That-
Allowable zoning.
Yeah, allowable zoning. And then overlay zoning, that'll be a separate topic.
Overlay zone going to put the opt-outs against, isn't that what the overlay zone is for? So it's-
Yes. The,
well, and we can get into it. They are 2 separate sections. And so we'll need to just, again, we can get through more than what, we won't be going through 3. We're just trying to figure out the top. Yes, sir, in the back. I think you had your hand up.
I feel like it might be out of line and stuff, but I feel that the number 1 priority is to legalize as many cultivation sites to the 530 up as possible, because it would bring multiple dollars to the county, which would trickle down to everywhere. Because right now I feel like growers, and then I'm really sorry I offended anybody, but I feel like growers don't want to spend money in this county. They don't want to recommend to their friends to come over here. I have multiple friends who left the county and said, oh my God, never again. That was the worst years of my life. So I feel that the regulations and the attention to the growers must be a little bit better.
Okay. And is there any particular part of the ordinances that you wanted to make sure we focus on related to that goal, I would call it?
There was one gentleman who was speaking on the previous session who said that you guys are cutting out half of our.
I was wrong.
Oh, I
I was
see.
wrong. I was the first one to say that I understood that and interpreted that wrong.
What about like the processing of applications?
Designated area stuff.
The
Yeah.
processing, I mean, just 3 years ago, I knew not to touch Lucas. Right now, I know not to touch Trinity County. We just have to take care of that.
Okay.
If you understand.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Now, I understand it's a broader goal and concept. And then what we need to do is focus in on, well, what about the ordinance and the proposals that are being made would achieve the goal in your mind? So we'll get there, hopefully. Okay, and then up here and then back there.
Rick,
Oh,
can I,
yes,
the people online cannot hear the people in the thing, so they are asking if you could.
I will
summarize what you
repeat.
did
Yep.
Last night.
okay, thank you. Yeah, I gotta remember to do that. So part of the feedback that we were just getting there was about, it was more about the goal. And in this case, the goal being focused on, we need to look at the ordinances from the perspective of how it will allow us to support those cultivators who want to get into business in Trinity County. But generally that's it. And then we just have to see where the audience feels like that belongs in various parts of the ordinance, because that's the real focus. Is it's not, we're not debating the program. We're just saying, here's a proposed ordinance. We want it to be the best. What's your feedback? So yes.
Yeah, one of the items should discuss this general plan in relation to the ordinance. Why come out with the ordinance before the general plan rezoning?
That was a big question of mine, I think.
So the question was, why are we dealing with the general plan before we're, or I mean, the ordinance, sorry, yeah, I got that backwards. Why are we jumping into the ordinance changes before we're just waiting for the general plan to play out? And
The amount of participation in the general plan far exceeds this ordinance.
well, yeah, the comment was that the participation for all the various workshops of the general plan participation perhaps exceeds what we've seen here. I've been to many general plan meetings. I've never seen one that had this many people in it. They usually have a less than half of this. It's just there's a whole lot more of them because they're spread out all over the county. But just a general comment about that, and then we can have it on the list to prioritize. I will tell you from our internal discussions, the general plan is still going to take another 1.5 years. And in the meantime, we have ordinances that have problems. We have, our staff has to keep up with 10 different ordinances. There are conflicts between our ordinances, and there's conflicts between our ordinances and the state. So we didn't want to wait for that general plan to complete its process, but there are things that we believe could ultimately get resolved through the general plan. So maybe we'll get there, and again, we might talk some more. Yes, John?
Follow a little bit on what he was saying. I think the priority needs to continue to be processing as many appendix C before we change the rules or something like hammer staff with a whole series of chores, like a whole bunch of stacking permits. So I don't know if it could be phased in over time, ordinance, or perhaps pushing the implementation date up forward on the calendar a bit might make sense. The inherent remains to bust out as many appendix C as possible. Before we pile a bunch of new chores on staff, in fact, it might be wise to give them a little break from the time they're processed the last of the pre-sequa type reviews. That are now appendix C and CEQA reviews. But maybe if they could have a little bit of a breather to just focus on perfecting renewals perhaps, before hammering on.
Okay, so for those listening in, the feedback is really stating that their focus should be on helping us have the bandwidth to get through the existing set of applications without perhaps burdening staff with all that might come with adding in stacking or any other big bureaucracies or anything else with this. And I won't speak on staff's behalf. If we get to this subject tonight, then I'll let them weigh in. But please know, this isn't the board or the CAO driving this. This is the staff. So the staff is championing this on their own behalf because they feel like this will help them support the program much more effectively. But point well taken. Anybody else? A list of things, Tom?
I just can't quite see because it's a little below my set line.
Okay.
But do we have appeal procedure criteria?
Yes.
Yes. Appeal criteria is here, Tom. Yes.
Would that include our ability to appeal a violation as well as their ability to appeal our license? Because so far there's no.
Great question.
there's no pathway to it.
We will make that part of that discussion when we get there. And the question was, is that appeal go both directions, basically? And so I think it's more focused on how it works the other way, but it's a good opportunity for us to have that conversation. Understood. Yeah, understood. Okay, Lisa, and then.
Just, and I don't think it's gonna hit the top 3 or whatever, but I wanna make this point, is funding sources for the cannabis program. So right now, we're only funded with our fees. There's some questionable use of our fees, being beneficial or not. But if we're gonna fund code enforcement, then why don't we get some of the fine revenue back?
Yeah.
And why doesn't the board maybe consider allocating some of the tax collection into augmenting staff in order to process more of these, which will inevitably lead to more tax? So it's just that whole kind of funding of the cannabis program in general.
Okay, thank you. I'll be there in a minute. Terry, Veronica.
Just on some of the things, and I don't know which one it would fall into, would be the permitting process, whether it's a director's permit or a CUP. Because I know some of it seemed to read like it would be more of a land use right, entitlement right. And so I want to, and so nothing that's up there, so I'm not sure what it would fall under. It might just come up in conversation as we start hitting. some of this.
Would that fall under the permit versus license?
Probably be an under allowable zone.
Under allowable zoning? Okay, so I think we'll get there. So when you're voting, think about that. Okay, are we ready to, oh, Terry, I'm sorry, I forgot.
To break even, they can't drop our program to then take money to fill the general fund. That's actually 100% not going to hold up. I don't care what Margaret says and what case law she thinks. I've already spoken to an attorney about this very seriously. It could be legal if the funds were redirected back into the program. It not being that way, and then saying you're borrowing money from the general fund for us, now you caused the problem. And I think that needs to be rectified before we go any further. We want to get a second opinion. Margaret Long is Margaret Long, and we need more second opinions.
So the comment is kind of echoing or building upon a previous comment, which I don't remember if I repeated, so folks could hear it, but it is about how the funds are allocated to code enforcement and whether or not some of those funds should come back into the program. And generally, how is the program funded and how are the funds used? So that's a general concept, and some of that is covered in the ordinance, but a lot of that is just more behind the scenes policy. Am I correct? Because I just want to.
Yeah, if we want to get into the discussion of that now, or do you want to vote on it?
I'm just trying to be clear because when we go to vote, we're not really here to have financial budgeting policy
Agreed.
decision discussions. I understand it's very important, but what we are here is about the ordinance, and we do have things in the ordinance about what fees are charged and things like that. So I may just have to separate us because important discussion, something we need to decide upon as a county, but this is specifically focused on how does this ordinance need to be written to best serve the county.
So
I just want to differentiate that, and I'm not trying to sidestep an issue at all.
To clarify, Rick, essentially, there is a sentence, I believe, in the current ordinance that does cover that topic. It is not specifically addressed in this proposed first draft that we've released.
Okay, and where is that sentence, Drew?
I'd have to pull it up for you later if we get into that topic.
But would it be in fees and such, or enforcement, or?
I'd have to double check.
Okay,
I
all right.
don't know. Off the top of my
We'll
head.
figure that out, and so if we need to kind of come back on it, because if it's part of the ordinance, then absolutely want to talk about it. If it's not, we just need to, I'll create a sheet for parking lot of important matters that need to be discussed. Okay, I think we're ready to vote. So again, we're not limiting ourselves to 3, we're just choosing which ones and in what order we're going to tackle things. So think about your top 3, honor system, raise your hand.
Rick,
when I'm
can I interject for a moment? We aren't able to see raised hands on Zoom. So I think for tonight, if people want to vote on Zoom for topics, they need to type in the keyword, and then that way we can pass that information to you as far as voting.
Okay, so what I will say then for the folks online, when I call out each area and I'm checking raised hands here in the room, if that's one that you want to use one of your votes on, put that word in there. But don't put the word in there beforehand or else it'll get lost in the mix. Fair enough? Okay. All right. So we'll start with the list on the right. This is my non-portable microphone becoming portable.
Isn't there just a way to go down through the ordinance?
We spent,
Around the one on the list, and we have concerns about a whole bunch of other stuff that don't get discussed.
so
Public workshop.
Yeah, I agree.
So the question is, can't we just go right through the ordinance? I will tell you, we spent 3 hours last night, didn't get through this size of a list, which means that we would never get through the entire document. So the point is, what is most important for you to talk about tonight? We will go in order. We'll get as far as we can go. There will be another meeting next week right here. There is the cannabis.ordinance at trinitycounty.org. And I know, in fact, you guys sent some great notes that have already been submitted. And again, we're not trying to limit it. We're just trying to make the best use of the time. And I can tell you from the experience walking through that, we would get through 10% of it versus here we can get through a good prioritized list.
What if we went through a portion of it and then we picked up where we stopped next week? Instead of just starting over from the beginning next week.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So the question, can we just pick up where we left off? Well, let's see where we leave off tonight. Okay. So your first, again, 3 votes. Who wants to focus one of their votes on consolidation? Another 0. Okay. Permits versus licenses. What I'm asking you is, what are you're going to raise your hand 3 times for the 3 most important subjects tonight. Consolidation was really just about, why are we consolidating? What does that look like? What does it mean? That's why nobody raised their hand last night. It's like, well, do what you got to do. but we want to, they were big things that we did. So we wanted to make sure you had a chance. Yep. The second one is about basically in this process that we're going through, we're shifting from referring to issuing licenses to issuing permits. And there's more to it obviously than that, but that's the primary thing. So there was only 1 vote last night, but how many people here? 0 to anybody online? Okay. Non-conforming uses, how many? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands, 7 hands here. Any online? Okay. So I've got 8, I think. All right, stacking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Online? Okay. Land use buffer, and this is basically that difference between setbacks becoming buffers. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Online?
1.
Thank you. The overlay zones, which is kind of like the opt-out, opt-in thing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Online, 9. Okay. Any on Zoom? Okay. Allowable zoning, which is related but distinct. So 1, is that 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody? No, okay. Appeal criteria. 1, 2, 3, 4. Online? Enforcement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7. What have you got? Okay. Fees. Okay. Okay. Definitions. 1, 2. Online. Finances for code enforcement to the extent it's part of the actual ordinance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, let's just do that there.
That's my third vote.
Okay, so if you didn't vote for enforcement because you were saving it for finances for code enforcement, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm making that 11. Okay, manufacturing. Non-storefront retail. Medical conditions. The general plan versus ordinance, it was kind of that timing thing, I think. Timing, kind of like a timing phased implementation. So John's concern about if you roll this out now might hinder us. Okay, and funding sources. All right, so. Yeah, we tried. Well, but you know, this again, we got through more than is on that chart last night. We'll see how far we get tonight because a lot of it is based on what you guys have to say. We don't spend that much time talking about it. We spend most of our time hearing what you have to say about it. But based on what I see here, we have our number 1 would be land use buffer and then enforcement. So Drew, if you want to tee those up and you can make a introduction. So Drew will first kind of talk us through the key components of that land use, or the land use buffer. And then we'll take, and what we're really looking for is your questions that we need to answer about it, your concerns that we need to address about it, and your suggestions. So Drew?
Yeah, can you give us the page number? 16 and 17.
Yeah, I wish the slides had what section they were referring to. That would be so helpful. The beautiful slide, but if they would have some information on it, it was fine.
We appreciate that.
That's a great suggestion. All right, so basically what we're proposing to do here is we've clarified that the term setback is really an inappropriate term as it relates to the current commercial cultivation variance process. A setback refers to a distance between a property line to within the property where there's an element. A buffer is the ability to set a distance between an element within one parcel and an element on another parcel. Is that clear to everyone, or does that require a little more explanation? Okay. So there are no changes to the required distances that are currently established as setbacks. We're just modifying the terminology to be more appropriate with the way these terms are used in traditional planning.
And Drew, isn't the other component that's part of this too, that those then become, once approved, ongoing instead of up for reconsideration annually?
So that is something that, in terms of the administrative buffer reduction process, which is we are proposing will replace the current commercial cultivation CCV process. It would be a one-time administrative approval. So currently for CCVs, if there is, right now, the way it works, if there's opposition for projects, then they go to the planning commission. So that process would remain in place. Previously approved variances would convert into an administrative approval. And for projects that are opposed by a nearby resident, they would go to the planning commission, same as the current CCV process.
Can I have a question?
So yeah, so now what we want to do is just engage, and if you would, please just raise your hand so I can kind of keep in order and we can go. But yes, sir, go ahead.
David here. On specifically, you have an established buffer. It was a variant before, so now it's an approved buffer. And somebody builds a property closer to the property line. So between the two buffer, the present buffer zone, and then complains about having marijuana too close to their home. And it becomes a director's use decision only.
So
Here, go ahead.
Or that person gets to apply and say, I don't want the marijuana there anymore.
So Drew, just let me repeat the question before you dig in. So the example was given that a cultivation operation has approved at this point setback, becomes buffer zone between it and whatever is on the adjoining property. That adjoining property owner builds something new that is within that established buffer. And what happens? Is that what you're asking? Okay, that's one question. We'll go with that.
So the way that we've proposed it is that if after a buffer reduction is approved, if someone builds within that required distance, that would not affect the approval of the buffer reduction. So to clarify, currently, an initial CCV goes before the planning commission. Once it's approved, it becomes it's an annual CCV, and it converts into a director's use permit for the subsequent years of renewal. So to limit unnecessary workload for staff and to prevent unnecessary number of items coming before the planning commission, which bogs down our general, planning process, we've proposed that it's a one-time administrative buffer reduction, and it's no longer an annual, it stays with the project for the life of the project.
And in that specific example, if let's even say it was a vacant lot next door, and then the property owner of that vacant lot chooses to build something within that established buffer zone, that would be their choice. They can do that. They're not restricted, but they can't say you can no longer grow there because you're within the distance of where I've decided to build my house. So does that clarify for you?
It does. It doesn't wash. This was why. Because right now, it's the opposite. If you have a resident sitting there and he doesn't say, wow, I really don't want that marijuana use this year, but he wants it next year, you have something for that, right?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Object to a buffer zone first year, but he's gone through the smell or whatever it is that bothers him, and now he wants to enact that buffer zone. You're saying that's impossible.
You're saying he wants to oppose the previously approved buffer.
So he's allowed it within that. Let's say there's 350 feet. It's within 250 feet. And he said, okay, But now he's experienced the growth and he says, wow, that was way too much. I want that buffer zone back to 350. He can't do it now. Is that what you're saying?
As proposed, yes, there is not the ability, but we could certainly, consider incorporating that.
Just give me the chance to repeat. So I just want to make sure we got yelled at a bit last night because we weren't being heard. So the concern was that somebody is maybe kind of trying to go with the flow initially and says, okay, it's okay to, I'm not going to oppose what happens. And so it gets approved. And then they experience it and it's a bad experience and they say, well, now I want that setback or buffer applied. And the answer is the way that the ordinance is written now would not support that. It would say, once they've been approved and they're investing their money to build structures and do everything in that place, it's not going to be taken away from them because there's a change of opinion or even a new owner of the property. So that's the way it's written now. And if you, again, I'm documenting concerns and suggestions. And if that's what you want me to document, I will. I just want to explain.
That's what's in the new one. The old one allowed for that.
No.
Because of the annual nature, it did allow for that.
Okay.
Anybody to object.
Okay, so the point is being made that is the way it's written today, the annual review would allow for that challenge, if you will, to come up. And the new ordinance doesn't. And so that's a concern that you want to.
That's why the buffer was there to begin with. It could go the other way as well. You have a resident sitting there and a grower comes in and disturbs his peaceful existence as well. So what you're doing is making it only one-sided. You understand what I'm saying? So, fair is fair. I'm just saying you got property rights, but now you're taking them away.
I would also implore everybody to ask the question of what other use requires your neighbor to give annual permission.
It doesn't matter. We're talking about cannabis.
Thank you.
As a planner, I like to compare things to all other uses and not just specifically.
It is strictly for cannabis we're talking about, so it's apples and oranges.
No, it's not.
That's not
It's
fair.
just a-
Well, if you know, that's what we're talking about.
And I have,
Okay, hold on.
I want to step in here a little bit for a second because I was there, okay? You have to remember, I was there when this ordinance was crafted, the original one that doesn't work. David is right. I was on the planning commission when we approved these things because I remember having those conversations. Well, if you don't like it next year, you can appeal. There's guys in this room that remember those conversations too. It was one of those areas where we had to reach a compromise in order to get anything passed because there's 50% of this county that hates cannabis and there's 50% that wanted it. And we came up with this idea. It's not a good idea, especially from Bella's perspective. As a planner, that said, okay, this is how we're going to do it. David is correct. In our original ordinance, it gave the neighbor every year an opportunity to take your license from you. And I've had that discussion with people on the planning commission saying, if it was me, I wouldn't put 120 grand into that site because your neighbor barely let you have that this time. So keep that in mind. Okay, you don't have to agree with it, but that is actually a fact that that's how our original ordinance was written.
And let me just, be clear about this. What we really need to avoid is arguing because that's not going to get us anywhere. But we do want to take in the input. So we hear this input that is a concern about that change. And I'm gathering that there's input that says that's a terrible change. So I just want to make sure let's not get into arguments. Let's just voice our opinions so they can be captured and move on. I'm gonna go to Tom first and then I see several hands. Go ahead, Tom.
I think, number one, I think this buffer zone is a good development because I think it does add some more certainty. When we were crafting that ordinance, a lot of what we're handed was these existing operations. Say, oh, how do we allow these people who've been there to keep going? It wasn't so much forward thinking. We're more forward thinking now. And if you want to be licensed, you're spending a lot of money. You're investing in infrastructure. You're investing in CEQA compliance, all sorts of stuff. But one of the things we get from that investment is fairly detailed mitigation measures. So rather than say, I don't like cannabis, you can say, the dogs are barking. the smell is bothering. The generator is too loud, we can articulate what the problems are. And there may be ways to address that rather than you can't be here. I know we have, I don't know any feedback yet on our odor mitigation plan, but there is a. And so if we break down the complaints into their constituent parts, maybe we can at least compromise. Nobody's gonna be completely happy where there's neighbors that don't agree, but at least maybe they can vote. Exist together, coexist. But I do think this is a much better approach, if only for the economics of staff, time, and planning commission.
Okay, and just so you know too, as we, get some different feedback here, there are times when we'll come back and sort of kind of get a feel for the people that are here, how strong is the support for one position or another, because we don't want to get to that point where everybody feels like, well, I want to say what he said because I really believe it. We just would rather say, let's raise our hands and we know, and we don't have to waste time hearing it 17 times. So we will come back and do some of that if we feel like there needs to. Matt, I think it was you and then you.
I'm just kind of reiterating something from yesterday that I want written down, but I'm hoping. This would be a suggestion.
Okay.
Kind of concerned, but I'm suggesting that we try to move back to the historical definition of buffers that they're measured with canopy, instead of how this new ordinance states that it shall be measured from the closest point of any structure or outdoor area containing or being used for cultivation. I might be wrong, but I feel like that is new. And that the historical definition is from mature canopy.
So let me repeat. Yeah, let me repeat what I'm hearing. And the comment is that a request that we go back to the way the program was originally implemented, which was that it was things were measured from the mature canopy versus, what was it, last year sometime? It was then changed to say the cultivation area, which can include outbuildings that are also used for whether it's processing or everything else. And that was an interpretation by staff at the time that, well, if you really read the way it's written, this is what it says. And so then that was the new way of doing it. And this did come up last night, and someone had suggested that it go back to that mature canopy piece. And part of the feedback last night was to say, if the concern, it may have been Adrian even, if the concern is the outbuilding and so forth, well, there's ways to mitigate that, but the real concern from a sensitive stuff and all is the canopy. But let me just capture that, and then Drew, if there's anything else you guys want to say. Anything else, Drew?
Well, just to reiterate what we went through last night on this topic, and I think you were listening on Zoom, Matt. So, but essentially, staff's viewpoint at this, currently is that we took that item to the Planning Commission. It really is the definition of cultivation, not cultivation area, just to clarify. And it's the elements that are captured under the definition of cultivation. So considering that the Planning Commission did not approve sort of updating the definition to capture the original intent, we just went forward with sort of the conclusion that we'd reached during this past year, which was that, those outbuildings and other cultivation related elements would also be included as needing to comply with the buffer distances as proposed currently.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
So this is obviously one of the bigger issues that we face. I'm glad that we're discussing it like this. What Drew said is correct, is that the state definition of cultivation includes drying, processing, which includes storage buildings. And when the county moved to that, to adopt the state definition, it brought up the issue that there's hundreds of us with outbuildings that are now inside the buffer zone. And then there was a flood of variances that needed to happen. And, as a business, we need certainty. So when personally, I work for a general contractor in Reading, and we have to do variances as well. And once that variance is obtained, we're building buildings. And if a neighbor changes their mind next year, we can't push back buildings. It's not that easy. And I do feel for a neighbor who might, I don't know how we mitigate that other than say, be careful in giving your approval. But, once that's given, we're developing land. We've gone through EIR processes that have defined our boundaries based on these areas. And we need to have some certainty that we can operate a business. And as Bella mentioned, in other planning and land use areas, this is just not even a question. Like once that's been obtained, like I remember there was one right down here on Main Street, the gas station has a variance from the sidewalk setback to have his overhang. Well, if somebody changes their mind, you can't move his gas pumps back. It's just, that doesn't happen in any other area. And last night, Mr. Letweiler, you told a story about a horse barn, so I really appreciate it. Felt like telling it again. I thought it was very appropriate for the situation. But this is hands down one of the biggest issues because it's setbacks from neighbors. And we need certainty, and our neighbors need certainty as well.
Okay, thanks. First of all, please call me Rick. But so I just want to repeat, first of all, I took it as echoing what I was hearing about going back to the canopy implementation, mature canopy implementation, and identifying the fact that when we implemented, whether we did it correctly with the wording that was there or not, we implemented it telling people it's okay for you to do these things within these areas. And then when we decided we had interpreted that correctly and implemented a new way, that meant all these people that had invested whatever time and money in building those infrastructures or whatever approved by the county now would either have to move them or get variances. And so from a stability standpoint of approving. And then you referred to my story, which was really, I think, about non-conforming uses, but we were talking about non-conforming uses that can get adopted in, and our property happens to have a barn that was started 45 years ago, and the second story has never had anything but side studs. There's never been any cover to it. And the planning inspector, building inspector was out one day for something else and said, if that falls, you get to do everything from scratch by permit. If you never don't let it fall, you can do anything you want to it because it was before the requirements. And so it was just a personal example of how I was experiencing that whole non-conforming thing in a very different way, I guess.
Horse barns in Arizona.
Oh, okay. So the horse barn example was there's in Arizona. It's grown so much, but they used to have a lot of horse land, and over time people sold that off to developers because 10 of the 20 fastest growing cities are in the Phoenix metro area. Well, people would basically move in and then want the horse farms to leave, even though the horse farms were there in the first place and they knew the horse farm was there when they got there, but they didn't like the dust or the smell or the noise in the mornings or whatever. And so, yeah, it was a very real example that my wife experienced when she went to her barn every day. She rode at a training barn. So yes, sir, I think you were next, and Adrian.
This sounds like a great idea. And as somebody who has a variance, it sounds like it's gonna save me $700 a year.
I'm sorry, are you talking about the buffer part? I just want to make sure which part we're on.
Yes.
Okay.
And where I'm going with that is for somebody or people who have got a variance. This sounds like it's gonna be great for people who haven't got one because it's really hard to get it. So that could help streamline your guys' job. But I just wanted to mention that it's really important that this one-time administrative, whatever, that's leaving variances in limbo. So I just wanted to reiterate that it's really important that we work together, staff and people who have variances and this new plan going forward, rather than just leaving variances in limbo, if that comes about. And so I'm here to advocate for this, because if I'm correct, it is going to save us a lot of time moving forward. But there's not a concern of administrative, right? It's normal to get a little bit worried when that comes up in the county, that we could, we could get lost in the shuffle. And so I just really wanted to reiterate that as we come up with this new plan, as we maintain the existing farms, the existing agreements, variances are agreements with the county. I think
So what I'm hearing in part is an endorsement of the approach of implementing these buffer zones that that are not renewed or reviewed every year.
Right, and it also is putting a one-time burden on those of us who are a little bit uncertain of our existing variances, because there's sort of variances right now. It's not.
But last year, they paused all variants.
So anyway, I'm saying we have a mutual agreement between the county and those who have achieved variances to keep maintaining things going forward.
Okay, so Drew, or before you answer, Drew, the comment is about those that have variances, and we did kind of put a halt on variances and so forth. And so Drew, I think maybe you can answer the question, if there is a variance in place, you kind of already addressed this, but please clarify. Basically, it would be reviewed under this new process, and if approved as a confirmed buffer zone, then that's approved, then it just stays in place.
Yeah, so to clarify, the concept as it's proposed is that existing CCVs would convert to the administrative buffer reduction.
After another review or just automatic?
Automatic, yeah, that's what I kind of want to know, because we already have a variance, right?
So the question is,
Something that's good.
the question was, if it's an administrative variance that's in place, you're saying it would be automatically converted? Is that, I just want to make sure
I think that that's a great thing to point out, and that we need to make it clear what the transition would be from the old plat process to the new process. So you're not stuck waiting for an answer and waiting for what's going to happen that year. So I think that's great feedback. I think we need to add more clear language into the ordinance as it is right now, to make that more clear that they would be essentially grandfathered.
Okay.
If they've already been approved by the commission. That's the sentiment we've been working with.
Okay, so we're going to pause for just a minute. I want to write something down, and then we're going to take some votes.
I still have things to say.
Okay, so we've identified, I'm not trying to cut off conversation on this, we can keep going. But we have heard some concerns, we've had some questions answered. And what I want to ask is for a raise of hands, when you hear with the clarification that's been provided about what this new approach means as written, do you support it or oppose it? So I would like you to raise your hand if you support the new approach as written. No, so, okay, so let me rephrase the question if it's not clear. Okay, so let me rephrase the question. The question is the concept of changing from variances to buffer zones, and once buffer zones are approved, they are not up for debate every year. That's what I'm asking you to vote on. So if you support, raise your hand.
No, I'm sorry, I gotta clarify. What they, I believe, said was that there would be no review if there's a current variant approved already. It was just grandfathered. So the current landowner who's granted a variance has always had that opportunity to say, no. Now you're taking that away from a period.
And that's what I'm asking people to say they support or oppose.
I could.
Not period, you know,
Yeah.
one time.
Yeah, I could accept, okay, the very first one, you go up for review, the landowner has the ability to have the review from the commission. And then once that's done, then it's over.
Yeah.
But the landowner that's currently, under the current ordinance and law says, wow, I've granted this variance every year because every year I can say no. That is legal definition. Now you're saying, even if he said no, okay before, he has no right now.
That's what we're voting on, dude.
But what I'm hearing is, what you're saying is, if in implementation, there was a one-time ask of the person who had supported a variance, because the person doesn't grant the variance, the county does, but the person can oppose or not. You're saying if there was that one-time part in the transition and then it never got revoted, then you'd be with it. Okay, without that, you'd be against it. Okay, so let me first do, just as it's written, that just says they're converted, they're there, you support it, raise your hand. Okay, this is as written. Variances get changed to buffers and they don't get revisited every year. I'm not talking about mature canopy right now.
You're saying we support the whole thing.
No, I'm asking specifically what I just said.
So if they currently have a variance, then they automatically get a buffer and it's a lifetime buffer.
Yes, that component is what we're voting on. So raise your hand.
I agree with that.
Okay, online, are we getting votes?
There was a question, not yet.
Okay, all right, so, and then those that are opposed to it, as I just stated it. Okay, and then if it was changed to give that one-time chance.
I can't vote yet. I've not had a chance to talk about it once, and I've been in the queue for a minute.
Okay, all right, so where we are right now, that's a good sense of the concept. So go ahead. I didn't realize I was missing you. No, I really.
Hold on, I raised my hand online and I want my hand to be counted, please.
Yeah, we got those.
Thank you.
Okay. So while he's writing, so my suggestion on it was the buffer zone could go possibly, rather than having it forever, you know, and being able to take it away. I like the idea of a buffer zone because as a business person, and just to go develop for this, I grew up in a farming community, hog farm, cattle farm, crops. There are unique characteristics to those businesses that do require different rules to provide public safety and welfare and all the good living we all want to do. So there is a difference in that. So that would be my statement on that. But going back to having a buffer where maybe every 3 years or a time frame where it gets revisited for in case mitigation measures might need to be adhered to. The dog's barking, the odor is escaping, because one thing I've learned in the planning commission and the past meetings is there's mitigation measures for everything. I'm told, and it's in the EIR, but they don't get implemented right off the bat. They come in as those issues come up. So maybe that's a better idea to look at. Maybe there's at least a review process so that someone can come in and say, listen, this is what's happening here. Maybe that's an idea. But then going back to what the other thing I was going to say was that you would have to move the current variances over into any new system on a case-by-case basis because of what you just said. Is the fact that the landowners that supported it spoke and said, yeah, because they knew if anything came up and there was a problem, they'd have the opportunity to have their voice be heard. And so I think that's where I think business people need to have the confidence in what they're investing in and doing. But at the same time, like you said, 50%, you know, and because of some of the zones that this is allowed in, that buffer zone becomes a really important key piece of a project. And so just to make sure that's kept in the mix as well. You know, because a lot of things, like I might not approve, but you'd approve, or vice versa. And I think that's an important part too, because sometimes I think our subjective side comes in, whether we mean to or not. And but that would be my suggestion on the buffer zone. I don't like it as written, but I think there's some creative wiggle room with it that's being presented.
And the main thing I heard there was if there was some ongoing potential for review. Was that the main takeaway?
If there was some potential for review, rather than, calling the law and something's happening here. I mean,
okay.
We want to take away the divisiveness and the tension that tends to to exist, but it doesn't need to.
Okay, so let me just, yeah. And we'll talk too about, that's somewhat under enforcement. It wasn't just about the code enforcement that we always talk about and the money and so forth. It was about ways in which we can address people who have concerns and deal with those. So I just want to do a time check. We are at 7:10, so we're an hour in and we're on the first subject. So we can keep on it or we can move to the next one. It's your time. But I just want to make sure we're aware because we heard, well, I just want to go word for word and you can tell we really wouldn't get very far. But here, this is your top priority and we're an hour in. You guys still want to talk about this? Okay, go ahead.
Dan is absolutely right. In the very beginning, this was part of the brand compromise. Had been worked on for at least a year and a half prior. Since that time, several things have happened that have kind of changed. Number one, we have state licensing. Number two, we have CEQA. Every single one of these county permits, state licenses, is going through very robust CEQA process that forces mitigations on these operations. And there's tremendous protections. There are annual inspections that are forced on the county via the TAA versus Trinity County. It's another opportunity for the county to catch elements of an Appendix C that might be out of compliance. Also, in the very beginning, one of the reasons for the variance was discretionary action under California, and was seen as a means of making giving our program a very important discretionary component at that time for the greater impact operations that had a close neighbor within 350 feet of that odor. Since 2016, as we slowly implemented this cannabis program with many stumbles along the way, the annual variance is one of the clunkiest parts of it. And continually has drug staff down and stopped projects and stifled economic development. The first 7 years of the program, everyone built their operations, designed their operations to the original standard, original interpretation. Pure plant cannabis. It does not make sense to do this new ordinance without really taking a very serious look at that. We're talking about impacts, environmental impacts, forcing all these operations to change the design of their farm. 7 years in, tremendously impactful.
So let me just stop you for a minute, John, because one, I want to make sure that we keep moving and we're really digging in on this subject. But for the audience on Zoom, basically some reasons given about things that have changed since this was first implemented that provide a lot of other ways in which issues can be addressed. And towards the end, when I cut you off, sorry, was a call for us to go back to the way it was originally implemented. And not requiring people to make a lot of changes that were originally approved because of the way it was originally implemented. So let me just ask that question. And this is, again, I apparently not phrasing very well because there's always confusion when I ask for the vote, but the question is, do you oppose or support moving back to the way we originally implemented, which was measuring things, whether they're variances or buffer zones, from mature canopy? So if you support it, raise your hand. If you oppose it, raise your hand. Okay. And just so I understand, and folks that are for it, help us understand the reason for opposition for moving back to the way it was implemented.
A warehouse and you're drying mature plants. The smell from them is the main smell period, right? There's only a couple of weeks where the plant actually stinks or it doesn't stink, depending on your I'm still up in the air on that myself. So after that 2 weeks of mature stand, they cut it down and they put it in a warehouse 10 feet from your property line. And it dries for a month and a half. Just like tobacco, you want a nice smooth.
No.
Okay.
You've never seen a weed plant?
Come on, come on. Okay. Okay, so the concern is that some of these,
Now that whole operation is not in the mature growing area, but now moved right on the border of the property line and smells to high heaven. And the operations that come in, all of the traffic, except for, are done 10 feet from the property line when everybody thought, oh, wow, that's supposed to be.
okay, so it's two things. One is a perspective that people believe that the distance that would be from the measurement on the adjoining property would be 350 feet or whatever from all of those kinds of facilities, and specifically calling out the possibility of the drying sheds or whatever they are, referred to probably in different ways, where maybe the odor can be intense, especially if not mitigated through fans and filters and so on and so forth. So that's generally the concern. I just want to make sure, again, I don't want to belabor this, but I just want to hear.
It's, for me, it is those issues that could arise from the buildings that are closer. But for me, it's because, as I said earlier, mitigation measures are created within our EIR and within the program right itself, but they're not required for implementation. I was just at a planning commission meeting where they said, well, let's make sure that they put the odor control from the beginning. Like that is part of what they have to do to get the life, to move forward. And everyone, great, okay, that's great. But because that's when I found out that, and Director Pavani said, no, it's in there that if it starts to bother anybody, then they can add this stuff in. And the problem becomes is everybody's so busy within the division, within enforcement, within the cannabis industry, within people that are not in the industry. Who's gonna go check up on that? Who's gonna follow up on those? And people say, we've got a complaint. I've been involved in this now far too long. And it doesn't follow through. It doesn't follow through for you sometimes, and it doesn't follow through for us sometimes. So that's my reason being for it, is that if there were mitigation measures for some of these unique characteristics could be implemented from the get-go, then I would probably be more comfortable with it. But if they're not, that's where I move away from.
Okay, so the follow-on concern for those listening in was, while the documentation and programs and approvals are all based on having mitigation plans in place, understanding that, but those aren't required until somebody raises a hand and says, hey, it's a problem. And then there's a long delay in getting that implemented. And so basically the person who's affected by that has to deal with it for a long time. But if those mitigation requirement or mitigation plans were implemented and required to be implemented from the very beginning, you'd be more comfortable. Is that fair? Okay, so Drew, do you want to comment about that at all? Just make sure we're all at least have a clear understanding of the mitigation requirements and how and when they need to be implemented.
So yeah, specific to the odor mitigations, the way that staff has interpreted the EIR is that once odor concerns are lodged, then the odor control plan would be required to be implemented. There's a few things that are important to note. One is that odor control plans are not required on ag zone parcels. And so, they're obviously with the mixed zoning in Trinity County that may or may not address the concerns of neighbors as it relates to odor. The other thing that's important to note is that you seem to be of the opinion that staff is not responding to odor complaints, but in fact, during this year, for approved projects that have received verified odor complaints, we have actually gone out and ensured that their odor control plan has been implemented, and they are starting that phase process of making significant reductions to the odor that's being generated. The other thing that's important to note is that outbuildings are the most easy to mitigate, the most straightforward to mitigate odors with the use of carbon filters. It's a sealed building. It's much more straightforward to mitigate odors from a drying structure than from outdoor canopy or greenhouse. There was one other comment that I wanted to make related to this concept, essentially, which is that one of the reasons that we've landed on not doing annual renewals of the CCV or the conversion to buffers is that we have some disconnect between the county process in terms of the licensing timeline and the DCC, or the permitting timeline, we'll use the appropriate terms going forward, and the DCC licensing timeline. So it creates a significant dilemma, I think, both for county staff, for financial risk to the county, and then potential financial loss to the operator of that operation if we have basically a DCC license that expires, that runs from June to June, and in October, their CCV or their buffer reduction is up for renewal. What do we do with the local approval versus the state approval? And so that's one of the reasons that from an administrative perspective, it would be more straightforward in the grand scheme of things if our renewal dates with local licenses and the state were the same. That's not where we're at, and likely we won't get there anytime soon. So in order to prevent that confusion, which is, you know, what do we tell an applicant who paid $15,000 for a state license, and now we're saying, sorry, you need to shut down your business because your neighbor now opposes your project in the middle of your cultivation season when you've paid for a state license. So that's just some of the thinking behind why we've gone towards one-time approval. That being said, you know, the last comment I want to make is in terms of the initial approval, it sounds to me like, you know, the place to land in terms of trying to find a compromise would be that in the conversion of existing approved CCVs to administrative buffers, that we would do sort of what we're doing now, which is the neighbor consent and opposition form, which then gives that neighbor the ability to oppose the project, take it back to the planning commission for them to approve the conversion to the buffer zone. And that's probably the likely compromise, at least one that I can think of where we could land.
Okay. So I'd just like a show of hands of who's ready to move on. Okay.
When you have multiple buildings, you have a 10,000 square foot canopy. Well, now you virtually allowed a form of stacking because now all these outbuildings are doing the same thing and contributing to that 25,000. That's the way we look at it. It's like, okay, you've got a 10,000 square foot building you're buying in, you're loading the plants in, whatever.
Your permit is based off mature canopy.
Okay, but we're just hearing a perspective and that's fine. But okay, we're gonna move on. So your next prioritized matter was enforcement, because this will be easy. Okay, so Drew, do you want to set the stage, tell us the page?
Sure, I can tell you the page. We do not have a slide prepared for this topic. Do we? Okay, we do. All right. We'll find the slide, and then the page is starting on page 21.
Is there anything you want to do to introduce what's significant change so that people know where we're kind of starting from your standpoint?
We're gonna find it and pull it up on the screen as well. So I'll give us a sec to get there.
This is specific to that forestry program.
Correct.
Okay.
So one of the things in terms of just general consolidation, we took the existing denial revocation section of 1743 and then included additional language that was presented to us from Rincon Mentor Harnish and sort of combined all those sections now into this new updated section, which is titled Enforcement, Suspension, Revocation, and Fines. So off the top of my head, there are no like hugely significant changes to the concepts. What we've tried to do is just make it more clear in terms of and also add the ability to, rather than just deny an application or revoke an existing license, sort of paralleling the way that the DCC has the enforcement process set up. There's the ability to suspend a license while applicants work through non-compliance issues. And then there was no ability to levy fines against non-compliant operators. So we included the ability for there to be fines issued from the cannabis division directly.
And as that last bullet says, the piece about right now, kind of everything was 7 days to address, and this can require less than 7 days. Correct?
If we determine that it's an egregious, violation or a significant threat to public health and safety.
Okay, so I thought I saw your hand up while he was talking, so let me go here, then here, then here.
I just have a question, and fully acknowledge I may be misunderstanding this, but in section B, number 7, that any act or omission by an owner or contravention of state law or the Trinity County. So to me, what that says is breaking Trinity County code, which could a dog license ticket, jaywalking. It could be me owning another property that I bought that has a fence that's too tall that the previous guy built. And in California, you inherit violations. So like, it just seems very, very broad and vague.
So I'm going to just rephrase, and I think the staff was capturing the exact point in the documentation, but the concern is that the application could be so broad that it is not really focused on the intent of the program. So I'm going to write that down, and Drew, I'll let you comment anything you want to.
But if they break, tell me if I'm misunderstanding. It says, I feel like it's saying if I break anything in Trinity County code that my license is suspended.
If I get a speeding.
I'm sorry.
ticket,
Agreed.
Yes.
Yep. Totally. Yeah. 100%.
Or referencing 1743.
Exactly. 100%.
In which case 1, 5, and 7 are the same thing.
Yeah.
So we got to tailor it. Okay, so the feedback, if you couldn't hear, is Dan had a suggestion. There was other comments, but apparently there's multiple sections this would apply to. But if we just focus in add wording that focuses it on specifically cannabis related codes and requirements and everything else, then there's not the same concern.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Yes. Commercial cannabis, sorry. Go ahead, Veronica.
I would like to know if we could write something in for habitual violators. That's been an issue. And I don't mean like different things along the way, the same thing sort of over and over, and then getting fined for 7 days of abatement. And then later on, same habitual violation.
So question is, do we have or can we have something that basically escalates the penalty, if you will, for repeat offenders? If you continue to do the same thing, instead of just always being told stop it, that something more significant happens that causes that to more likely stop. Fair? Okay.
Just to respond to your comment, we've actually had significant discussion about this with the ad hoc committee. And I think in terms of the discussion we've had, from my perspective, prioritize is the violations that create a significant threat to public health or safety. So, should they have their license revoked if their tarp blows off their greenhouse 3 times in a year? I personally don't think so, but I understand what you're saying. And right. And we can certainly look to try and figure out, what other enforcement concepts are out there.
Only once, or twice, you know what I'm saying? We have a lot of
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, Drew.
Now I'm back on. In our discussion with ad hoc, Rick has actually brought this topic up because I know that it is a significant concern in areas, in some areas where they don't have a local approval, but they have a state license. And so in my opinion, and what I expressed, in our conversations about that, is that my expectation is that that dynamic will go away because there's going to be an end to the renewal of provisional licenses at the DCC level. And so my hope is that essentially all of the projects that get local approval will then have a state license. And the projects going forward that don't have local approval at some point will no longer be able to maintain their state license. So that specific example, I hope that, the maturation of the program will remedy that in and of itself. But I do agree that it probably would be good to have some tiered approach to either, the enforcement or the fines. And I think, we'd be happy to work to include that.
Okay, yes.
Goal 16 for applicants to show that they were participating in commercial cannabis under Proposition 215. It was intended to bring already impacted sites.
So the comment is about support for what was being discussed about having some sort of tiered or escalating for the right things and for the right level of escalation, if you will, or tiering, but to not include in that holding back the ability for someone that perhaps did grow without a local permit to ever then join the program, because that's in fact what the program's about. Fair? Okay. I think somebody else back here. Oh, yes.
My question is just, is 7 days the North County standard for a code violation correction?
So the question is, beyond cannabis, is 7 days to address something common, or is that just cannabis?
I believe that 7 days is like a code enforcement industry standard, because it's in building code as well.
Okay, and Trent's saying 7 days. Okay, and so the question was, is 7 days a standard and for the county, and apparently it is, and okay, all right. Okay. All right, other concerns or questions or suggestions about this particular section that we've been talking about? Yes, John.
There be some means of healing and enforcement.
Yeah. Currently, there's no way for us
Some sort of due process to, I guess, deal with enforcement. Yes, it needs to be, enforcement needs to be built. Big tiering it. And today we have a wonderful staff that are very well versed in years. They're doing a good job, but there needs to be some kind of process.
Okay, so for those listening in, a call for an introduction of an appeal process for code enforcement related matters. So if we do apply some kind of penalties and so forth, that there's some appeal process. Is that?
Yeah, I think in years past, there was an administrative. Such matters in Trinity County, but for years, as the cannabis program was kicking off, that person was John Fletcher.
Okay, so I've got Tom, and then Chris, then back here, and then Matt. Didn't you have your hand up, Chris? No. Okay, never mind. Tom.
As far as the list of violations, I was thinking, I've said this many years now, we should just adopt the state regulations for violations. We can enforce them.
Oops,
sorry. Staff that are trained to speak that language, as far as our cannabis division staff, I think, is conversant in state regs for cannabis. I get a little more concerned when we have, like in number 3, water board, CDFW, that are more nuanced enforcement mechanisms. I understand, okay, Fish and Wildlife comes on your property and gives you a violation for the material in the stream. Okay, fine, that can affect your license. But I've seen problems when a county inspector is alleging fish and wildlife violations or something. I'm happy to see us doing that with TCC. I think they make it relatively accessible for local inspectors to do that. And then it's easy for us licensees because it's the same clipboard.
Okay.
So I'd like to see that. And then I'd like these other agencies, I just don't want us to try and bite off too much of our limited staff. Our expertise is, harder, but it's mostly on campus. We have Fish and Wildlife, they will come out and have violations verified. Most of these things aren't going away. Like, you landslide with debris, you clean it up overnight, good for you. But most of the things that trigger Fish and Wildlife, the water board violations, are going to be.
So again, summarizing for those listening in, the really a call for us to be more aligned with the state listing of issues to be addressed and things to be held accountable for, and to not push too far with what we're trying to get our staff to have to try to interpret and enforce. Is that?
Yeah, and there are some uniquities to our county regulations that the state doesn't have, for instance, but more often than not, we pretty much overlap. And the water storage, all we track much closer now than the initial ordinance did with state regs. So, the closer we can get our enforcement for that.
Okay, and I do know that talking with staff, there was an effort to try to deal with some inconsistencies between us and state and other things. So, and Drew or Bella, any comments that you want to make about that?
Yeah, I would like to respond to some of your comments, Tom. In terms of CDFW or water board violations or violations from any other county department or division, in the last year, we implemented a formal referral process. And so for, let's say, a potential CDFW violation, essentially the process now is to send a formal referral to the agency whose regs, those regs are within their jurisdiction, to basically say, hey, this is what our staff has observed. What do you think about this? What would you like to do? How can we facilitate that? And, sort of simplistically, where we've landed is in many cases just basically saying, hey, water board, do you want this project to proceed? Because we're sort of capturing many of these right now in the current paradigm in the pre-licensure inspections. And so we're referring that to the applicable agency and basically getting their feedback as they have much more experience and awareness of their own regs. So I just wanted to kind of give that some additional context there.
Yes, sir. I've got you.
Is there a way within the ordinance, or I stepped out of the restroom, so maybe I missed this, but how do we prevent administrative violations from escalating to guns drawn law enforcement issues like the dog that got shot? Is there something in the enforcement within the ordinance that gives us a little assurance that tarps blowing off or isn't going to escalate to that level as quickly?
Okay, so, and specifically looking for, is there something new or different in the ordinance that would, okay, and so question is referencing some of the raids, for lack of a better term, that have taken place. Is there anything in the new proposed ordinance that would help provide some kind of a better clarity around what's going to involve just quote normal code enforcement that might get a penalty from the director and so forth, versus having the police, sheriff and other groups coming in.
From a code violation
Okay.
to a felony search warrant.
Okay, so I think Drew, I'll let you speak into this, but I do want to be clear, we're not in the position to tell the sheriff what he pursues as legal issues or not, but we do,
Codify it, so that what do we have to do past so that he has to follow the law just like every
You
other.
guys can give him direction to treat the code violation.
can write
code
any
violation
law.
on felony search.
But I guess my question was kind of from the opposite perspective.
Okay.
Is law enforcement using our ordinance as an ordinance violations as a versus you were kind of presenting it the other way, but I see it the opposite.
okay. So let me ask the question, Drew, if is there anything about when you are receiving or we collectively are receiving concerns about violations of the program that translate into you turning that over to the sheriff?
I will do my best to clarify as much as I can on this topic. So there's a difference, and I think most of you are aware, there's a difference between a violation, a code violation within the cannabis ordinance and criminal search warrants that the sheriff's office is pursuing. In discussion with DCC and, related to sort of Tom's comment, I think we've really been looking at, okay, how do we parallel our enforcement process with that of the DCC so that we're on the same page? If we observe violations of our code, how do we get the DCC to take action? And one of the places that it's been interesting to see is that the DCC essentially has multiple layers of what they refer to as administrative remedies, which all come before legal action or, criminal search warrants. And so, as I understand it, related to the dog incident, those search warrants and those activities came as a result of something completely outside of the cannabis program. Those came from essentially, and I don't know all the details because it's really outside of my purview, but my understanding is that those were not county licensed sites. Some of them may have had state licenses, others may not have. Again, it's not really within the purview of the cannabis division. But to clarify the concern, essentially this enforcement, suspension, revocation, and fines section, the reason that we've added fines is to add another layer of administrative remedy so that if we observe non-compliance issues, those non-compliance issues are handled in-house by our code compliance staff and dealt with first with a 7-day notice of non-compliance. That's the existing process. So in terms of what the sheriff's office decides to do with criminal search warrants, we really have nothing to do with that, with the exception that if we receive complaints for sites that are outside of the permitting program, we refer those directly to the sheriff's office for them to pursue. Anything that is within our program that has a pending application or an active license, we deal with those in-house with our code enforcement, code compliance staff and go through the 7-day notice of non-compliance process. Hopefully that helps to clarify a bit.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, and I think it's important for us, just a second here. I think it's important for us to note that, so what we really are saying, if we're talking about anything to do with enforcement within the program, then we're dealing with that. If it's outside of that, that's a separate issue. But I did mention that I would create a parking lot because things come up that aren't what we're here for, but they're important, and I'm hearing from the group that they are. And the two things I remember, and you can remind me as we go, one was the kind of financial decisions about how program funds are used. And this especially goes to the whole, how much money goes to code enforcement through the legal and all that. And then the second one, which we're just talking about, is perhaps, at least the way I worded it, is more clarity regarding what triggers law enforcement versus code enforcement program. So we'll capture that so that we don't lose it. We can bring that back, and CAO and sheriff and board and maybe can all have conversations about that. But okay, so yes, David.
How much notice do you have to give a license for coming onto the property out of proposed violation? For instance, I call up and say, boy, there's a lot of snow. Do you have to call up the grower and say, hey, I need to come out, what's a good time? How much notification you need, or you show up? You're not law enforcement, so you don't have the.
So the question is, when there is some kind of a complaint about a violation, then how much notice does staff have to provide before they go out and check on it? Okay, Drew?
Essentially, as I understand, the existing process is it's 24-hour notice.
Okay, yes.
I just wanted to make one more technical note in item 3. The applicant is not fully compliant. There are points in time in DCC regulation. So maybe the language could be changed to say something like not compliant. It would have to be more like not in the process of complying or something, because like you get a small violation for something about the measurement. I got a violation for my garden being too small. I couldn't expand my garden. It was like a secret process.
Okay, so the comment is about a concern that there's it's a little bit too much of a black and white about if something isn't done, when in fact it might be more appropriate to have something that shows that there is a phased approach to implementing the solutions or the mitigations or whatever it might be. So Drew, can you comment on that?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I'm aware of a few instances where going through the pre-licensure checklist that we have, where there have been existing violations from, say, CDFW. So staff has coordinated directly with CDFW staff to basically get their input as to their stance on the level of egregiousness and whether they believe that the project should be halted, or whether, you know, in the instances that are coming to mind, oftentimes they've said, okay, we're working with the applicant or we're working with the site, and we've entered into agreement with them that gives them the timeline that agency sees as appropriate to resolve those violations. I don't know if that helps sort of answer your concern, Adrian. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that we've executed a little discretion in there, analyzing the level of severity and relying on the experts in the field. So maybe we need to consider writing some type of language like that.
Well, if you
You wouldn't get a
under
Trinity
B,
County
that language is
violation.
already in there because it says may. It doesn't say that if you have that these shall be grounds for suspension. They say may. So it gives discretion to the staff to say, okay, this is a minor thing and we're going to just move on.
But Adrian, I think what I've captured here is though that we need to figure out if we need to address the issue of phased or in-process mitigation or implementation. Just is language required or does the may cover it? But just understanding that as long as we feel like somebody's really doing something about it and it's happening at the pace and progress that it should, and so language can be considered for that. So I'm missing track of when the hands are going up, but John and then Matt.
DCC and some other state agencies use language of underway and ongoing for that period.
Okay.
And county code uses language like ordinance uses language of being diligently pursued. So we can stay consistent. County language by borrowing that or relying on that. Stay consistent. State language by using underway.
I think
Matt, and then Veronica, I saw your hand go up. Yes.
Just want to reiterate how important that fuels process can be and everything, like what Drew about Fish and Wildlife acknowledging that there's violations that are ongoing for Bird County, like the situations. I currently own a piece of property where my neighbors are objecting to the property line, and they are illegally diverting water off my land, and they're illegally crossing through waterway, discharging sediment. I am noticed, and I have violations from Fish and Wildlife for it, but they have come and walked the site with me and seen that they fully acknowledge that it's not me doing it. But in order to clear up the property line dispute, I have to get a survey. So like, I'm just bringing up that there's unique situations that can happen where appeals
Okay.
are needed.
So for those listening in, just a good example of where, lack of better words, bureaucracy causes us to have to go through so many hoops along the way that you can be doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, but you can't make some government agencies move faster than they do, or some processes get implemented. But if there's a good will, good effort, okay. Veronica.
A concern I have with the in process and ongoing is it can be very subjective, and historically, in the past, we've seen some people use that language and that opportunity to milk the system to the detriment or discomfort or whatever of their neighbors and or their community in some way. So I understand that there needs to be some discretion, because we're all working hard to try and get somewhere sometimes, but I caution it being the kind of language that can let it linger and linger and linger and linger and linger, which has happened over the last several years. And there are several projects, because I've been to the ad hoc meetings when they were different supervisors and open to the public, and those were concerns that were brought up then as well.
Okay. And so what I wrote down is in those efforts, make sure that we maintain accountability for actually addressing the issues. So don't let the potential for discretion to just let something basically always go on that, well, they're working on it. Don't worry about it. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Ready to move on? Okay. All right. When we revoted and stuff? Okay, so, and that was what I kind of put somewhat in the parking lot. So we had those two things about financing for code enforcement. Thank you for reminding me. Again, they're to the extent that we're talking about something that would change in the proposed ordinance, then we should be talking about that. But there's nobody in this room that individually could make a change with that. The board would basically have to say, we're going to change the way those funds are allocated. And we can capture input, but it's not really about the proposed ordinance as I understand it. Right. We do have things in here we haven't talked about yet, but in the program under the fees, and we had some lengthy discussion about this last night, was the general planned component of fees that have been an annual $1,000 amount for cannabis permits is being replaced, as it was written, with an EIR. So basically saying, okay, we don't need this program to continue funding the general plan. We have enough money to complete that, but we will need an EIR. And then there was still a minor amount for the general plan. I think it was like $75 to be more in line with what others pay. What we heard last night from the audience was two things. One is, at the most basic level is, let's let the people who benefit most from updating or rewriting our EIR pay for it. Because if, we've already to some extent paid for the EIR that is we are currently operating under. So if it's about new or different ways of doing things, and that's what means we need a new EIR, well then let's figure out what that would really cost us and who all would benefit from it. And then let's have a charge for that instead of just unilaterally saying, well, let's charge $1,000 for EIR now instead of for this. So that is something that we got as feedback last night. And then the general plan part, I think if I boil it down, one of the popular answers was, well, you could charge me $75, but first take it out of the $1,000 I paid every year for the last 5, 6, 7 years. So when I now have to pay 75 because I'm not already covered by the 6,000 I already paid you, then charge me. So I'm just sharing some of the feedback we got last night. But I do want to make sure you're clear that as written right now, the general plan fee transitions to an EIR fee, and but a general plan fee of $75 is in there still on an annual basis. But I kind of shared the feedback that we got last night that we took notes about. Lisa? Okay. Okay. Overlay zones. Okay, overlay zones was the next up. So this is this whole thing of basically kind of trying to move away from this approach that we've referred to as opt-outs and come up with a more clear, formal way that we can apply an overlay zone. And that could be to create a place that excludes cultivation. It could also be a process that allowed us to include cultivation. So
I can carry on with that.
Okay.
Thank you, Rick. So it's on page 18 of the updated ordinance. And what we're trying to do here, what Rick said, is create a uniform process for any group or person that wants to opt in to have cultivation activities or opt out of having cultivation activities in a certain area. It would follow the typical rezone process, and it would be at the cost of the applicant or applicants. And that way, and just a little zoning background, when you have your overarching general plan, where you get your general plan designations, and then below that you have your zoning districts, which clearly state your allowable uses and what level of discretionary permits are required for specific types of activities. And then under that, you'll sometimes see a zoning overlay district, and like there's the special treatment district is technically the historic districts here. You have different plan review overlays that have specific building restrictions in specific areas. So it's more appropriate and more uniform to follow the overlay rezone process. So that's what we're presenting here.
And just briefly, some of the feedback we received last night. Let's see, some of it, we identified the fact that many of the current opt-outs, if you will, are in areas that will be receiving new community plans as part of the general planning process. So that would be an opportunity within that land use planning process that we could use. We even believe that we will have some money left over after this. We've paid the consultants for what we've already asked them to do, so they could potentially be engaged for additional work upon this. And there was discussion about whether the existing should have to, kind of be reapplied for, if you will, through this process, or if they would just be adopted in. And so there was comments about that as well. So what did you guys want to talk about? I'll start with Matt, then Chris.
Okay. I was hoping I can have a minute or two of this. These opt-out zones, exclusion zones have been quite the blight of my life for the past 7 years. I've been cultivating since 2006. I'm a legacy grower. I want to do this right. Really putting me on the spot here. But anyways, so yeah, we're going into the overlay zones. But okay, so we're stating that in section C, number 4, you need to have 60% of the property owners with 50% of the land use. Now, I'm only talking about Coffee Creek and Trinity Center here. I'm not talking about Lewiston, which has defined their opt-out boundaries around neighborhoods, and they have found 50% of their land use and over 60% of their landowners. Not completely, but much closer than the hundreds of square miles that are broadly covered through Trinity Center and Coffee Creek. Now, in my opinion, I think that those opt-out zones do not fit our community. It disenfranchises our community. There's really a handful of like 10 people in Coffee Creek and Trinity Center that oppose legal commercial cannabis. It's a strong economic driver for our community. Many people have been supplementing their income through cannabis for many, many years up there, for generations. Like, and none of us are disagreeing with the fact that cannabis should not be in downtown Trinity Center. It should not be in downtown Coffee Creek. And every single parcel in those densely populated neighborhoods is within 1,000 feet of the school. They can't even get a license. But it's stated in here that these areas are supposed to be exclusion zones because they are in high proximity to densely populated areas. And this is just false. It's not true.
Well, just to,
Turn these opt-out zones just automatically into overlay zones, it's just not something that our community asked for. The petition originally is full of signatures from Lewiston and Taurus and second residence homes, and our community was not asked about this. Lewiston decided this for us.
and so Matt, just to be clear,
Coffee Creek and Trinity Center was lumped in to the opt-out in the beginning with Lewiston, and it was the state petition.
so just from a standpoint of what we're giving as input to the ordinance, what I think you're saying is that you would like to see the Trinity Center, Coffee Creek area meet the criteria of what you see. But you're okay if it was done by the way it's written?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
But this states that it's an exclusion zone because it's in proximity to high population, high density areas. And that's just not true. Like Coffee Creek and Trinity Center is one of the least populated areas in the whole county.
So I think we just want to be clear. This is not trying to describe what's in place. It's describing what the ordinance thinks should be in place. So
This is also stating on section A that no new permits will be allowed. There are lots of people, at least 20 people in our area that have water board paperwork that they have got pertaining to our ordinance that said we were grandfathered in and that we could get a license if we kept that paperwork current. County council even said we didn't have to keep it current. And now this is stating that all the people that kept that water board paperwork current, that worked so hard, I've spent $600,000 on getting my facility into compliance in 3 years. And now you're saying I can't license it. I have not grown weed illegally on the property. I followed every rule, every code. I'm like cleaning this property up after an illegal grower.
okay, so Drew, if you will just comment as to
That's unjust and it's unfair. And we've decided this before that the grandfathered farmers are allowed to get licenses.
okay, so let me
It's not right.
take it. So Drew, as clarify for as we are now within that particular opt-out, whether there are grandfather allowed or not. And then I just want to make sure, what does a new proposal implement a further restriction than currently exists for that particular opt-out? I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
So as I understand currently, what you're pointing out, Matt, is that there are exceptions to the opt-outs, right? And depending on which area, there were different water board enrollment dates.
Yeah. All had to enroll by November of 2017.
And
In
there,
Trinity Center and Coffee.
you know, I know at least a dozen people up there that have been maintaining that grandfather water board paperwork all this time, trying to bring the facility into compliance so that it can comply.
I know 5 people that were ready to get a license and the first property burned down last year. Every year before, or the year before, when it went up Coffee Creek Road, you know, like.
It's like,
They were right there and now it's taken from them. They've been growing weed up there way longer than me.
And you bring up a good point, Matt. This language has been utilized, or this concept utilized in other jurisdictions to sort of establish this concept paralleling opt-outs that we've established in Trinity County. And it is lacking the grandfathered clause or the exception to it. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I thought A, capital A after 17 excluded it, says it right there.
yeah,
That's what
the
I'm
problem,
talking about,
that's what we're
that's all.
talking about.
So if you've already got a license and people opt out that area, you keep your license.
Yes, but
Well,
that's not the
There's
way
also
our
that we're
opt-out-
grandfathered
that's
in
not
with
the way
water
that
board
opt-out
paperwork
works.
that allows us to
Nobody
get
ever
it.
asked for that, yeah.
Okay, so
It does cover it in the non-conforming use section, but your point is taken that it's not exactly the same as the terminology and concepts as currently established in the opt-out, so it needs some clarification.
Mhm.
And wouldn't it be considered?
Okay, so I'm just gonna cut this off.
So the
Hey, Matt.
non-conforming use says that I can't get a new permit, because that would be a substantial change.
So we're gonna move.
I think you're providing great input that we need to make sure is clarified and rolled over from the
We just
previous
want to make sure that
ordinance.
we move on to other issues and
I think
examples,
he's
but I do want to capture the main things that I think I heard concerned that some opt-outs, because I don't want to limit it just to that, but that could be a bigger issue. Don't meet the proposed criteria, and that specifically there's a concern about further limiting or restricting grandfathered in this particular one, or maybe in others as well. Because I'm familiar with some of the opt-outs where if you didn't have an active license, then you're out, period. Whereas you're telling me in Trinity Center, Coffee Creek, that was a different scenario and setup. So we'll just, as you said, Bella said, good input. We'll follow that up and look into it. Okay, so I saw hands, but Lisa, Chris, and okay. And what's your name? Thanks. Okay.
So I understand the Lewiston Community District, which I'm part of, never had a petition that had 60%, none of that was done, right? I was drawn arbitrarily because I was in CSD. There's a water board enrollment deadline that we had to be to qualify. So maybe for those people like the Trinity Centers, a certain amount of time, why haven't they applied yet? The licenses, application, right?
Financial burden.
Well, then, I don't know if there's
You got $100,000 to give you to build a bridge, and $32,000 for a survey?
But maybe they should
Like,
know.
I don't.
Need to be in the cannabis, I don't know. Or
Well, I've
maybe-
been in the cannabis program since 2010.
But-
Yeah, I can see.
Okay.
Look.
Come on, go ahead. Lisa, go ahead.
I'm not trying to, right, I'm trying to find a compromise where the overlay by the exclusionary zone process applies to the existing a period of time. But you can't just maintain that grandfathering because the water enrollments into perpetuity don't get into the program somehow.
Why not? That's what the law states.
May I continue, please? The county may have come up with some kind of financial assistance program through tax, the tax program, something like that to help those kind of people. But I think you have to be in respect of the consistency, consolidation, consistent. To not have to go back in time and say, oh, we approved this in 2016. No, it's now, this is a current law, this is how we operate.
Okay, and so Lisa, what I tried capturing here was propose that existing opt-outs be vetted against the established criteria. So that if they meet, if we come to agreement on what the new criteria should be, then we should apply that to the existing opt-outs and see if they still fit or not.
You never went through a petition, a formal percentage plan, that never happened, but
You're talking about the very original ones that were just established by like districts and so forth.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And the political appeal and allow the program to-
Okay. Got it. I'll clarify that in my comments, but in the meantime, I think it was Chris. And I saw that you had something.
Echo was, Lisa said, very much agreed that the current opt-out zones are okay for this process. That's just not equitable. And also, part of this is having, if you want to opt in or opt out, science. And I think that would be amazing to also look at, okay, well, if it's about noise or if it's about water, also look at other commercial activities or non-commercial activities also might be. So it's not just the burden of the cannabis program, but it's all things that would also noise or odor.
Okay, Steve was next, and then Rhoda, and then Dave.
I just.
Oh, and
Before I make my comment, I just want to clarify, can we clarify, is the intent as as written currently, that existing opt-out zones automatically roll into exclusionary overlay zones? Is that the intent of it?
So the question is, the way it's written, does it call for the existing to be automatically just now changed and made officially an overlay zone or exclusion? Okay, so the answer is?
The answer is that it does not specifically address that. And essentially what we're trying to do is just establish a criteria that more clearly defines how what we were previously referring to as opt-outs, the process is just more clearly defined and established, along with a typical planning process, which is an exclusionary
And I think
zones.
based on Steve, yes, and I think based on the comments that we've had over the last 2 days, we clearly need to be clear about that. One way or another, it needs to be clear when this is introduced, what happens.
Well, I think certainly if variances need to go through that process before they roll into their buffer zone reductions, then obviously opt-out zones should also. My other issue with the opt-out zones that's never really been addressed, that I would like to see addressed in the ordinance, is that there's large areas of the county that have opted to opt out of cannabis cultivation, but still get the benefit of cannabis cultivation fees as far as enforcement. So I think it should be in the ordinance that no cannabis enforcement money be spent in opt-out. So you know what I mean? Like you can't opt out and then still get the benefits. That doesn't jive. So there has to be. I would love to see something in the ordinance that codifies that. You don't get the benefits if you're not participating.
Okay, so the way I'm capturing that, and again, staff is probably taking better notes than me, but I'm trying to capture for our visual, is that opt-outs basically should be acknowledging as also opting out of benefiting from services funded by fees. Fair? Okay, that's what you have. So now I have, what did I say? Oh, Rhoda, David, Adrian, Veronica, Tom. My brain doesn't work this well, but go ahead, Rhoda.
Okay, so I'm gonna go with two because it's different. But so our North Lake opt-out zone in particular, and the original none of those petitioners that got created that asked for those opt-out zones, none of them asked to opt out of anything other than cultivation. But in every single section, it eliminates those other license types from those same areas, even though they were never requested to be eliminated or anything like that. Number two.
Wait a minute, I want to make sure I got that. So is your concern is that the way this is being written is changing the restrictions? Okay, which I think I captured already, but different kind of restriction, but we'll capture that generally, okay? Okay, go ahead.
And then talking back about how this one was created, and I know we talked about this, but if they only got 2% of the population to create the opt-out zone.
I wrote it there just to look weird.
And if they only got 2% of the way,
Yeah.
should apply.
Yeah. Or they should have to go back.
Nursery's
and
fine.
re-get their opt-out.
Nursery's
Okay, so would it be fair to say that you're saying that if we're gonna reapply the criteria to all opt-out, current opt-out areas to determine if they qualify for this, then you're okay, period. If that doesn't happen, then you feel like the same criteria that was used to opt out is opt in. Okay. Okay, got it. And David.
Starting with C2, the proposed cannabis exclusionary zone must be defined by documented existing legal boundaries such as existing water district, fire district, legally approved, reported subdivision, public road, private recorded easements. That would be like, okay, Kansas City Fire District? You gotta be kidding, right? Because that's what they were talking about, Hope Bar, B-Bar, K, Deerwood Springs. So, and this county doesn't have recorded subdivisions. So let's say you have my road, Marshall Ranch Road, that what, we have to define our own boundaries, but it states here that it must be a legal. There is very few legal boundaries. I know exactly what you're saying. So everybody has-
Ask her at least.
got,
There are.
20 houses want to opt out. We belong to the city fire district. That requires half the county.
So the
Find that, and that's, I just want to go through this real quickly, if you don't mind, and then.
oh, okay,
Yeah, thank you.
testing my memory.
Yeah, the number 4, the same thing, 60% of property owners representing 50% of the land. But it has to be that exclusion zone. You can't make up your own, correct? And fight, if you see a fight every single year for becoming one, and then the next year, somebody moves out, moves in, and you have a fight to opt back in. You don't need that in this county. That right now, that's what we have, and that's what we're fighting. We're trying to come up with an ordinance to stop that. But this baby here says, "Ooh, now it's legal. Every year you can fight this." You go back and forth, back and forth. Nobody wants that.
Okay, so let me just summarize that and make sure that I capture it right and if there's any staff comments. So part of the concern is that the way we refer to legal boundaries seems very limiting in terms of what that means. And I will tell you, I even raised the question to say, well, is a parcel boundary a legal boundary? It is, but is that included in this definition? And so it's clearly something we need to be more clear about. And then your comment about the 60% and the 50% was really about, well, if you have to do it by the more restrictive view of what legal boundaries are, how do you even get there? But if it could be by parcel boundaries and so forth, then okay.
You have a method to get a legal subdivision. We could go into the county, that's what's been planned supposed to be for, but you know, like city general storage.
Yeah.
What boundary is that? So can we create the boundary legally and then?
Okay, so basically we've got the documentation of this concern that has been raised before about concern about what we mean and how we should define the legal boundary so that it can be applied appropriately. And then separately, the concern was that this sets us up for every year this to be hit and not hit and so on and so forth. And I think that's a valid concern. You know, one of the concepts was that the general plan and the community plans that are coming and that whole official, very focused land use process could be one where it just says, this is what it is. And until we update the general plan, this is what it is. And then others would say, well, no, things evolve just like they evolved when cannabis was legalized. And so we have to be flexible and responsive. But either way, right now, at least the attempt is to get a formal, clear, fair, as much as we can find that fair balance process. But I do want to document your concern about that.
Nuisances, threats to public health and safety, non-compliance with any state law. Those are really difficult. I believe we're being set up to almost make it impossible for it to go either way, because in prior sections, it lists those same things that they're listing here as, no, you can't use those as an excuse. So what I'd like to see is a list of these are the things that can make that you have a legal reason for having an opt-out. Not that you do all this fancy paperwork, you spend all this money, and then you go, well, you know, like it says down here, if you're impairing public resources or a public nuisance that adversely impacts residents such as odor, it's contrary. It's going back and forth. It's going to make it almost impossible to apply for it.
Okay. So trying to think of the right way to phrase that. So what part of the concern there is that the criteria that is being seen as written right now makes it challenging and confusing as to what would and would not qualify. And just looking for more stability and clarity about that. Is that fair?
Process a couple of times. It's very difficult. And everybody in your approved boundary, let's say you go through the whole process and you have, you just don't want it. That's not gonna be good enough. Or somebody's gonna say, well, that not only social impact, but financially impacts me, so you can't submit it.
Okay.
Yeah. If I could add a suggestion, we may want to consider defining legal boundary and what that means. So we could release that in the second draft. That may solve that. And just to cover some other points, there are legal subdivisions in the county. So there are some subdivisions that could be used as legal boundaries, but again, we could look into defining legal boundaries so it's more clear.
Okay, help me. Was it Adrian? Okay, thank you.
C number 7, the findings. That they must not provide any equity. Yeah, that's in B. Most clear equity that I see would be following up on Steve's comment about fees is taxes. And that's not as easy to clear up because I would take 2/3 of the majority of revenue money. So in essence, opt-outs created an active. Yes. Right there. What also created active would be if the findings and opt-outs do not also apply to all other activities that may also happen those opt-outs, like any other business. Tourist activity. If the roads are not good enough for a small family farm, then they're certainly not good enough for your EV, so on and so forth. Then let's see, what we'd also need a real good definition or finding that shows how these potential impacts exceed the scope of the EIR.
Say that last part again, please.
How do the potential, the findings exceed the scope of the EIR? Like roadways, water resources, odor, dust, noise.
And I think though that a lot of this is more zoning, and zoning isn't necessarily based on resources. It's based on what people want in their community. So but Adrian, we're getting off on this equity thing, which drives me insane because I could make the same argument that it's inequitable for a cannabis farmer to be able to move in and cultivate a product that's federally illegal that could result in my property value being lowered. So that's an inequity to me. So my draft has that whole sentence stricken because there's no way to define equity except the value you've built by paying for your house. Okay.
But it has resulted in your property value going up.
But so the way I see this is not a CEQA issue. This is not are the roads good enough issue. I have to kind of go toward where David was leaning. This is a zoning issue. This doesn't fit my community issue, whether we like that or not, whether we think that zoning as a whole is inequitable. Zoning is, we want this in our community and we don't want this in our community. So that's where this is going to be a piece that's hard to work out at the planning commission level. Board level probably will be where a lot of this gets hashed out, and then the political part will come in. But it's zoning. I don't like it here will be the reason. If we make people find an excuse why they don't like it, why do we make them find an excuse? If they don't like it and they can get all of their neighbors to say they don't like it, And if you like it and you can get all your neighbors to say you like it, why don't we just let you guys do what you want to do with your area? Why don't we let people define their own community rather than we sit here in a room thinking we're smarter than everybody in Trinity County that lives in their own little groups? It might not be politically correct, but people are tribal, especially in Trinity County. You live with people you like for the most part. People group together with like-minded people. That's how people work. And if we let them say, we want to keep our community how it is, it doesn't really hurt anything. That's what zoning is to me. So this will be, we could go on forever here, but this is going to have a political fix. It's not going to have a scientific CEQA fix. This is all political. Their opt-outs are politics. That's basically all there is to it. I mean, that's the honest answer.
Thank you. And I want to come back to what I did capture, Adrian, is with Dan's least favorite term, inequity and equity. But basically that criteria that could exclude a cannabis operation should also be used to exclude anything that any other kind of business that could have a similar sort of impact. And I think back to Dan's comments. I don't know if I'm just too close to both mics. Yeah, okay. I don't know if they can hear me if I just project, so I'll try that.
Yeah.
But the whole general plan process that we're going under and the community plans that will come that's the process we've been going through with the consultants. They're meeting with people and saying, what do you want your community to be and what do you not want it to be? That is exactly what that whole planning process is going to be. And that can be about cannabis. It can be about, do you want fast food? It can be about, do you want tall buildings and do you want multifamily dwelling? And it will be opinion based on those community meetings and so on and so forth. So I agree. At some point, that's what the planning is about. And we're under a major effort to try to figure that out for the county as a whole. And then for these 8 communities that have been identified, or 7 communities in an area, right? Region, something like that. So I just wanted to frame that, but even within that, there should be equity about how that is applied. So if I say I don't want farms, well, okay, that you must mean all farms, kind of a thing. So we'll, as Dan said, this will not be solved here, but we want the input and we'll move on. And somebody help me, who was it Chris afterwards? Or it was you afterwards, and then Tom, and then Rhoda. Okay. Okay.
I wanted to address the existing opt-outs in the sense that some of them may need to, I would recommend being grandfathered in because they went through the process. It's different than the buffer zone that you're proposing in the sense that they weren't predicated on additional input in the future. It was predicated on, this is why we'd like it, this is why it shouldn't be here. A decision was made, money was put in for appeals and from both sides and everywhere. So it's gone through an appropriate process that wasn't predicated on the future, which is different than the variance. That was an annual. So those were all predicated on the ability for the public to come back annually and have feedback on that. The current opt-out zones, the ones I do believe they should be more of the proposed requirements. I'm not as familiar with the big ones, the Trinity Center, and those were a little before I got involved in this process. But the ones over the last several years, they've put in the work, and those decisions were not predicated on the ability to come back on that. And especially if you're going to say you have to pay now for a rezone for this, that just as a cultivator or anybody in the cannabis industry would say, you're hitting us twice. And I appreciate the idea of the balance that we could create. But some of those may need to be looked at to see if they can conform more to some of this proposed. And as to whether or not they say cultivation only, I know the ones over the last several years was all cannabis. So those of us that aren't in the industry, we don't always know the right words to use. So we go to you guys or the supervisors or those, and I had great, I learned a lot in the ad hoc meetings I went to so that I could speak well, or at least informed. And I think that's important to recognize as well, is that we don't know that you guys are gonna be, that this was gonna be coming in, and so, because we didn't say it 5 years ago, now that, you know, the intent, because that word gets used a lot, was they wanted, as Dan said, this is the area, that's how they wanna see it to look. I don't live in an exclusionary or opt-out zone or whatever we wanna call it tonight. But I know many that do, and I know why. So that's all I
Okay.
wanted to bring up.
And so in boiling that down, I think it's somewhat similar to what I heard before when Matt was first launching us into this discussion, is that there is some differentiation in some people's mind between the ones that were originally established by like special districts and so forth versus the, I'll call it petition-driven opt-outs. And so what I'm hearing from you is those subsequent petition-driven opt-outs you think should be considered for just transferring to, okay, you're an overlay zone now. Just because of the process that they went through. Okay, and we're capturing people's opinion, so that's great. Okay, so now it was Tom.
If I could lift one page out of this 48-page packet, it would be this one. This is important, but it is also the most delicate language in this whole thing of what we're trying to take. If we weren't in the midst of general plan update, I'd say, all right, we have to power through this. But this is really the stuff of a general plan, not just in concept, but because we have to be very careful with the language that we craft to make sure, because I agree with Dan. I think community should be able to say what happens in them. However, if that was the law of the land, there'd never be another halfway house built. There'd be no affordable housing in Palm Springs. It's not, our law doesn't allow for that, even though we all came up with the kind of happen. Our general plan process is the best vehicle to make that happen. I would be concerned that the ambitious project that this ordinance update is gets derailed on this issue that is both contentious and delicate. If we could kind of surgically take this page out and address it, not to say it's not time sensitive, but if we're going to do general plan update here, let's wrap it into that, rather than we could get this ordinance done soon. I mean, just the lawyer in me reads 7B. Every phrase in there, I could write 10 pages on. Oh, yeah. You know, but it has to be in there because we can't have an ordinance that says, sure, pick what you want. You can vote on it. The Constitution doesn't allow us to do that, so we need that section. So I understand where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
I do support that. I think it's better wrapped into the general thing. Just this.
And so, and way I tried to capture that, Tom, and for the people online is really a suggestion to hold off on this section and rely on the general plan, both because of the sensitivity, the complexity, but still recognizing the time sensitivity. And I would add just some anecdotal stuff for this time sensitivity is we actually had an issue where we recently found that we had 3 or 4 opt-out requests, some of which had been in hand for years, followed very different processes, but some had followed exactly the same process that those had been approved. And in the same area covered by that requested opt-out, there were 4 applications for cultivation permits, licenses. And so it's like, okay, what do? You know, which one came first? Do you not then process any applications because you haven't processed this application? What's fair? And so what we ended up finding out is that by the time we really got our heads around it, 4 applications were approved where there were 70+% signatures saying we don't want cultivation in this area. And you say, whether you like opt-outs or not, if you're looking at supporting your residents and your constituents, there was a group that was trying to do one thing through what they understood the process to be, and others doing another thing, what they understood the process to be. So that's part of the reason why it's had some sense of urgency and to get us out of this truly not well-defined process because there are urgency ordinances and things like that. But I absolutely hear what you're saying and captured the comment and very valid. Okay. Now, oh,
Just a question. Is there code currently, county code that allows for an opt-out process? I don't think that there is code that even allows. Am I accurate in that?
I am not aware of any.
it was really, it was,
Then you process the applications that are allowable. Say you're having a problem figuring out what to do.
well, and I understand, and so Lisa's saying, you know, if there's not code that says how you do it, then of course you process the applications that do have a code. And then the people that went through the process that others went through that got approved by the board say, well, why was it good enough for them and not for us? But I hear, you know, you choose your line to fight across. Okay, help me. There was somebody that was after Tom and it was who? Was it Rhoda? Okay, and then we'll come back to John.
So a while back, we were talking about, this opt-outs or opt-ins must be created through the rezone process at the cost of the applicant. So if the opt-out was created without having, like, are we still responsible for paying to rezone to opt back in when they never paid to rezone?
So the question is where we say that as we go forward with overlay zones and the concept that people should pay for that like we pay for any other thing that we make a request of the county to provide as a service. Well, if the people that originally processed an opt-out didn't have to pay, should the people that want to try to process an opt-in in that same area have to pay? Fair, is that your question or your concern? Okay. John, and then did you have your hand up again? I can't remember.
One quick thing,
Go ahead, Matt. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
just that you were bringing up the community plans, I just wanted to acknowledge our community strongly participates in workshops. And it says blatantly in our business, we want jobs. Carol Paul strongly disputes that, but it's in our workshop. The community wants it. It's there.
Rhoda, if I could ask, a while ago you stated that other cannabis activity or permit types, Rick, could I? Thank you. Are not allowed in the original opt-outs. If you could, we can maybe dialogue after this over email. I don't see where other types are not allowed in the original Trinity Center. I think maybe the restriction may be zoning more.
It's like even Carol Hall thought it was. But in every single section, it says this will not be allowed. This will not be allowed in any. Our existing opt-out would like to allow some of those other licenses, and opt-out petition never asked for anything else to be banned other than cultivation. And so non-storefront retail, for example,
Could you point that out? If that was an error that was made, could you point that out to?
it's in every single section on number 3.
Everything that talks about the exclusion zones is that the permit types and then you go into like manufacturing. Or instead of the aspects that says these will not be allowed in any of these areas.
I understand.
Okay.
But yeah,
Yeah, that needs to be, those lines need to be clarified.
So for the
That was not the
benefit of
intent
people
of
listening
adding
in,
that
there
line.
was some clarification going on about these seemingly greater restrictions on opt-outs that may already exist for some that are in place. Okay.
But also, like I said,
We're not allowed to
did.
get a micro business now.
No,
Because of this
Okay.
would have been allowed.
It was like in this section under.
Okay.
Retail and stuff.
Okay, and I think I have captured that notes and clearly Bella has because she's following up on detail. Okay, so I need to do two things real quick. One is, we asked this question last night, maybe more like midway through the night, but we have at least one more of these workshops to go. It's scheduled in here next week. The people in Hayfork said, well, gee, if Weaverville gets two, can't we get two? So we may be back in Hayfork again. But basically we said, do you have feedback about this process? So this workshop, we're trying to run in a way that gives us the best chance of gathering the input that will help us create the best possible program ordinance update. Do you have feedback about whether you think this is a good approach and process for these public workshops, or you have recommendations that you would like to see changes? Because we have one or two more and we want to do them the best way we can. So Veronica?
It might be a better process based on the fact that people want to be able to go through it. Because we may never get to something somebody in here wants to talk about in this process. If you broke it down, like sections 1 through 3, we're gonna do on this night. And then people that are interested in those particular areas could come to that evening. And if you want it all, then you're here for every meeting.
I agree.
But that allows a fuller discussion about everything.
Because we're not.
Okay, hold on. Hold on. So the first thing that I'm hearing is, if we set up workshops that were focused on specific sections and we just went through that section.
Every section.
Okay.
At some point, and it could be 1 through 5, some of the ones that are meatier, maybe there's only 2 on the agenda for that.
It's a great suggestion.
I mean, right,
But 9 hours is not enough. I agree with this.
And so generally there is both the concept of being section specific, but also of having, it sounds like, a lot more of these.
We don't have a lot.
But I also heard early in the very beginning is, we don't have a lot of time this time of year to be spending on this. So
And it could die in committee, like 60 years from now, we could finally have this ordinance. But I also kind of like the idea of doing it by section, but I also, we have great representatives, we're able to give feedback. And especially since you're not allowed. And
Can I make a comment from Zoom before I have to sign off here? Is that I don't know how to join this conversation from Zoom. Is that okay?
You're doing it, Jake.
Okay, I'm on the other side of the country and it's almost midnight, so I have to get off at some point. But this all reminds me, not in a fuzzy familiar way, but of conversations dating back 7 years ago. And I think the lesson we have learned, which I have heard some people in the meeting tonight talk about, is like the things, and Drew could maybe speak to this if he feels the same way, but the things that we have seen change that have streamlined have been finding commonalities and merging with state guidelines. Like we have to follow those guidelines regardless of what anybody in this county thinks of them, good or bad. Like, they're a constant. We have no choice in this, and nobody's ever going to be happy. There's never going to be a perfect ordinance. There's never going to be 2 growers that are happy. There's never going to be 2 haters that are going to be happy, but we have to follow those rules. And so I have found, as I'm like terrified watching again, is that when we go down these roads of thinking like we can make this perfect, we can make this great, like we still have to fall into those same guidelines. And so we're like kind of chasing a dragon here, what feels like 7 years in circles of trying to find a perfect solution in a set of guidelines that are already there and are imperfect. And I will say, I wanted to listen to the part about stacking. I don't know if this will ever get to it, but I think a lot of what we're looking at moving into adding new things to the ordinance. I understand that people want to tailor things in there, and I quite honestly, I don't even want to dive into that, but for better or worse, we've had a program since 1617, and things have been changed and tailored. And I would like to think, as things have gone badly, things have been fixed and changed. There is progress. This is a grossly better program than we have ever had, and a grossly better, more cohesive staff than we have ever had. Far from perfect, but grossly better. And I think that if we look at what we already have as an existing program, there are a lot of the guidelines already set forth in different areas of it, such as there's already a precedent of you need 50 acres of land for 1 acre of canopy. You need CEQA approval. You need to have been, in the program from a certain date, or you need to have had a water board, or you need to, all of these different things are in the ordinance, have been tried and true and set as an operating standard that people have had to adhere to. And I'm hearing a lot of people tonight talking about, like, you can't just change the horse midstream yet again on us. So I think that, like, I know I have been guilty in years past of sitting in these meetings late into the night, getting wound up and super passionate about the concept of making this thing right, making it perfect and making it great. But then you just run into a brick wall again. And that's why when I just heard the conversation of how many hundreds more meetings do we need of this? Should we micro meeting these? Should we do this? I thought to myself, it's almost midnight. I have 3 children. I have a really big job in a sinking industry. And the last thing I can do is go to more of these meetings. So that's my 2 cents. And you guys are all amazing for showing up. And I really, really hope that we don't see history repeat itself.
Night, Jake.
Right.
Okay, any other feedback about this process, future workshops? Steve, and then.
I think it's been one of the more productive workshops that I've ever seen. My concern is I don't think there's I haven't seen anybody with your facilitation skills that's able to do it. So without you facilitating it, I don't think we get the same result. But in other words, great job, Rick.
Thank you.
But facilitation is hard, and you've done that well. So it'd have to be a tightly facilitated workshop like this. Is seems productive.
Okay, and John, thank you.
Say about the same thing. I think more meatier more controversial topics, maybe specific workshop focus on those items. I think trying to rewrite something like our meetings in 6 months is plenty of mistakes to make. So to avoid those, the more of these we have prior to going to planning commission, and I think the more advanced notice we have to see planning commission, terrible place to make spur of the moment decisions based on especially policy. Briefly, going back to the last topic, your opt-out zones become exclusion zones. I think it's important we change the language we're using a little bit from opt-in or opt-out in. Everyone in the room here that pays attention to this has been in their sport for the last 7 years, understands what we're talking about. However, the rest of Trinity County could perceive this as having to vote to opt in generally. However, the program is countywide. The EIR is countywide. There is no need to get 50% of votes or 60% of votes within 50% of the land mass to have cannabis permitting, commercial cannabis permitting available in your area. It is countywide. We're talking about the ability for a community to opt out or to reverse that action.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. That is what the intent of that was.
Yeah. Something like that. Change that language now to avoid confusion with the rest of the. But
So let me just ask. Oh, sorry, John. Go ahead.
So, a lot that, there are other communities that feel like this is really important. Essentially,
is our approaching harvest season, and it's the largest employer, county, and especially the parts of the county that never multi-generational cannabis businesses that have never been. Or maybe if you got a license, they had to show up in person. But it's giant.
And you know, somebody, I'm losing track of last night and tonight, but I think it was last night, somebody was kind of raising concern of what we're burdening staff by forcing this on them. Maybe that was tonight. Oh, was it? Okay, thank you. And what I was kind of trying to say is the board didn't ask this, Trent didn't ask for this. The staff said, we need to do this. We got to get away from 10 separate ordinances. There's some fixes we need to make. There's some things we need to do. So there is this tug and pull of it is taking up a lot of their time. It is hopefully moving us to a place where we can be more efficient and have a more fair, better program. And it would be the thing that sets the stage for stacking, which was something that I know a lot of people either wanted or were concerned about for quite some time, but trying to find that right way for that to finally happen in the way that we think it should happen. So we're trying to balance that push and pull. But I think you've given us some good feedback for us to go back and I can't remember if we have an ad hoc meeting this week or not, but we can have some further discussion to say, okay, how are we going to go about this? You know, how much more are we going to do with this? How are we going to invest that time together? We have said from the very beginning that this needs to be a process that has sufficient community engagement, that people really feel heard, and not that you just feel heard, but we actually heard you. So we know when we go back to deliberate on what to put forward, it's a more informed position. And I know I have certainly gotten a lot more information out of these discussions over the last 2 days than I had coming into it, even though we've spent a lot of time in these ad hoc meetings. So I appreciate that you do show up, that you do have that input. I do get that there is so much detail here to go into. Our attempt up to this point has been to provide the email address that people can send stuff to, the comment cards, these kinds of meetings. Even in the chat, we're able to capture what people are saying in the chat. But I hear you. We have a lot more work to do for people to feel comfortable that all of the issues, ideas, concerns have been raised so that they can be considered when we try to put our best foot forward. Here in Steve, yeah.
Is there all of this, it came up earlier, the general plan is underway. And a lot of these things are going to be addressed by that. The zoning, I have lots of comments about that to allow the zoning and stacking and all the ones that all of us have brought up at some point, the meatier ones, if you will, are being addressed by the general plan. And when they go into their ordinance part of their schedule, will it replace anything that you guys try to get in before that? Is there something that's just more urgently needed to be addressed that would streamline the process, provide balance for all areas of the community that we could be addressing that isn't this heavy? And so that, you know, because are we doing something that's going to be redundant and be replaced by a general plan later on when they get into the ordinance part of their job?
Okay, and so again, for people in general saying, can we choose those things that have a sense of urgency and would make a big impact, but be less challenging to tackle in the short term, and then let the general plan, community plan process envelop more of this rather than try to work it through here. Okay, and Steve?
Are these meetings, I'm assuming they're being recorded on Zoom, are they going to be posted on YouTube?
Yeah, Vidette was able to get the one from last night posted on YouTube, and you can find a link on the Cannabis Division website. And then tomorrow we'll figure out a way to do this one up there. And so, yes, we are trying to make that available for people. No, they wouldn't, because unless they were visual, you wouldn't see it. But what we're trying to do is between my scribble and the notes they're taking, we do plan to document sort of what we took away. What are the key takeaways that we took? And we don't want to filter it to say what we like to hear, but what did we hear? Oh, all this?
It was a presentation.
Yeah, okay. So we're gonna do that. We're also looking at how could we turn some of these into frequently asked questions and answers so that, people see their thing, oh, okay, now I understand that part. But then also just generally, well, what are some of these things that we heard? And, here's all the ones from last night. Here's the ones from tonight, and these guys took a lot of notes. So we do plan to share more of what we've been taking in and then ultimately trying to reflect how we use that input to guide where we go. But I would say, with the ad hoc committee, which is generally Trent, Dan, me, Drew, and Bella, that we have a lot to talk about. Not just on this input, but also about how we move forward from here. Because we just, this is too important to not get right. Yes, sir.
I didn't see addressed, and, the community has made it quite clear, and I believe that 3 to 5 year licenses, they don't see them addressed. I think that's a great idea. It would really prevent staff from having these yearly permits now, to make them 3 to 5 years. And as far as the variant right now, if you're really trying to streamline, Drew's got the right idea. If there's no complaints, you just automatically process the current variant. Those 2 things would streamline, I think.
Hey, say that last part again, though, Dave.
The variance now.
So if I-
He's got to, I think, as it is now, they have to go before the commission, each variant every time, every year.
Oh.
And if there's no objections from a previously granted variant, it's just automatic.
Right, it should be a director's use.
Because
You go to the planning commission the first time. And
Yeah, then
renewals.
our hits.
It's his.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even do it. It's just automatic. Unless there's a complaint.
Should be.
Yeah, unless there's a complaint.
Yeah, it should be audited.
Okay, David, so I finally caught that one, and then my brain forgot the first one. What was the first one?
The 3 to 5 year license.
3 to 5 year license. Thank you. Okay, so we're at 4 minutes still. Somebody has some
Can you post
wonderful
these things on
words to
Facebook?
close out our meeting.
Do you guys have a Facebook account? Can you be posting these notices on Facebook? I'm not on Instagram.
We have some
I don't have that kind of stuff there.
So wait a minute.
we have a functioning Instagram account and we have technical issues with our Facebook right now that IT is working out. So we're trying to get access to it and
Readily available.
right. So we acknowledge that. We're just having issues we can't control that we're trying to fix.
Another thing I think that we could, do is we have an audience, many of you, I hope hopefully a lot of you have signed in. But one of the things that we could look to do is just have a distribution list too. So yes, when we post it on the website, we post it on Instagram, we post it on social media, but pretty easy to also say, here's a group email, and boom, you all said you want to be informed, here it is.
And we haven't been able to track that as well in the past because of repeated staff, but that's the purpose of the sign-in sheet.
So that sign-in sheet, that's what we'll be starting to do. Signing up, and you'll have to opt out when you're tired of hearing all about what's going on.
Sign-in sheet on the table. Sign-in sheet on the table over here.
And feel free to email info.cannabis if you want to be added to this newsletter list that we're collecting.
And your broad questions.
Okay, well, I know we can spend a lot more time. We're gonna figure out how we best use our time with you, and I appreciate your input. So much for coming out and bearing with each other and with all of us as we try to move this forward. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
You can email your broad questions also.
Yeah, I bet you can answer it in 2 seconds. Okay. Really opinionated.
What?
So the ones like, self-processor, I don't even remember. Okay. And then just you guys put one here.